Okay. Hello, everybody. For everyone who is here, I'm assuming you're here to learn the story of Milo and I. Um, and I have a long PowerPoint to go through. I'm going to wait to let a few more people join before I open the PowerPoint and kind of just do an intro and talk about why I wanted to do this live stream and my intention behind it. Because it's just that this topic and talking about myself and how Milo has influenced my horsemanship, it's such a central point of who I've become as an equestrian and kind of the direction that my focus has shifted towards in the horse world. So while there's a lot of influential horses that I've had in my life, he is one where I can source a lot of changes in myself back to him. And he was a catalyst for a lot of those changes. And it's just an important journey to talk about because I think that there's not a whole lot of times where people have had a horse for as long as I've had him and have documented their life as much as I have with him and are willing to look at the ugly moments. So I was kind of joking in my head about how essentially this live is going to be an eras tour of some of my most embarrassing moments and some of my most like shameful moments in horsemanship. We're going to be going through the eras of that. Um, and it's honestly hard for me because also looking back at a lot of these moments, it goes a little bit deeper than just being about how I treated him as a horse. Because there's moments where I was at negative points in my life, and that for sure influenced how I handled horsemanship and the way I went about doing things. So it's hard to look at sometimes, but it's such an important thing to do because I just want to normalize the idea of being self reflective and um, just being more critical of the way we show up in horses and normalizing the idea that that's okay. Because something I have noticed since I've started to do this is that there's this tendency amongst horse people to be really shame based. And it's interesting to me because I get the same types of people, like the same accounts that will shame me for mistakes that I've made in the past while chastising me for not being forgiving enough of upper level riders. And it's the type of attitude that makes it hard for people to own their mistakes, pivot, and change because when they own up to them, people are being mean to them for the fact that they've made these mistakes, even when they're well in the past and even when they've shown changed behavior. And then it makes it so that a lot of people do double down because being vulnerable and admitting to the mistakes that you've made puts a target on your back and it makes people want to treat you poorly. Um, so I want to normalize the idea of being able to do this and just make it more comfortable for other people to do. And I also think that another important aspect of this is just recognizing the fact that changing with new information is actually a very good thing to do. It's a very normal thing to do. It's nothing to be ashamed of. We should be growing and developing as we learn new things and as we navigate the world differently. We should just be changing our perspectives with new information. It's not a sign of being inauthentic. It's a sign that you're a growing and developing human being. Authenticity is not committing to never changing, especially when we're looking at stages of our lives where we were very young. But even then, it's never too late to change. Um, so we're going to just jump into the topic because I have a lot of slides to go through. Um, I made a timeline because I thought that it was important to note that prior to getting Milo, I was already seeing some shifts in my horsemanship. So I started riding at age 4 and I started to ride on Arabian horses. And I was taught very high pressure and punitive training methods with lots of harsh equipment. It was very normalized to ride in like twisted wire bits, Kimberwicks, draw reins, German martingales. I witnessed the trainer that I grew up learning from kick horses in the gut multiple times when they would bloat for the girth being done up. I once saw her spur a horse so hard that she created raw patches on his sides. And there is just a whole lot of other things that were not good horsemanship or good horse care. the horses at that facility, a lot of them got very limited turnout. There was a lot of horses who cribbed and weaved. And when I was young, I was taught that like when they were weaving in the stall, they were dancing. So from the get-go, I was taught a very skewed perspective of horses, and I was taught to handle them roughly. And initially, when I pushed back against it and was uncomfortable with it, I was told that if I don't discipline these horses and if I don't put them in their place, if I let them get away with these bad things, that they would endanger someone else and it would be my fault, which was a very powerful guilt trip to put a child on. And it started to make me more comfortable doing things that I initially wasn't comfortable doing. So my intro to the horse world meant that I was surrounded by such chronically stressed horses and such harsh training methods that that was my reality. I didn't know that there was an alternative to doing that for many, many years. And that was just how I was introduced to horses. So when I did get my first horse, who was an Arabian, um, he was stalled a lot, and then he was very spooky, and his go-to thing to do was bolting when he was quite nervous. And it was very frustrating because he'd spook at the same things over and over and over again, but he was chronically deprived of social turnout. So then around 2011 or so, I stopped competing and ended up having to move from the show barn that I was at because of financial issues. It wasn't a decided choice to do for the sake of the horse. So then he got moved from a mostly stalled situation to full-time herd turnout. And there was like an immediate change in behavior where suddenly this horse, who was chronically spooky and bolting and just very difficult to manage at times, he became very easy to handle just basically overnight. And I didn't have to lunge him before riding. He wasn't spooking at everything. He wasn't bolting. And it was just a very profound change in behavior. And it was something where I hadn't at this point changed any of my training methods or anything like that, really. So it was very clear that the change in his behavior was the result of the change in management and how he was kept. And this started a shift where I became very, very pro turnout. And I started to push back against the idea of traditional stalling practices. And I started to look further into the research behind this. And that was really one of the first shifts in horse welfare perspectives that I became very passionate about, was the importance of turnout, because it was very hard to deny how much it impacted behavior. And then all of the research that I looked at supported that. So then between 2012 and 2013, I fell back in love with riding, because around the time of the financial hardship and moving barns and stuff, like leading up until I moved barns, I was becoming increasingly disinterested in horses. I was starting out high school and I was trying to find identity, and just riding around in circles in an arena and having no real other thing to do with my horse, or like at least that's how I felt because I didn't have other skills. It took the fun out of riding, especially when he was spooking and bolting all the time. So I was going to the barn less and less and less. And then I moved barns and it kind of reignited my love for riding. But then I wanted to get into jumping. And I got frustrated with my Arabian. His name was Farley, because he started being very hard to catch. And it was a situation where, looking back, I find it a little bit funny on my end, because of course he was hard to catch, because every time I'd taken him out to work with him prior to that, it was a predictor of a very unpleasant experience. It was very forceful riding. It wasn't fun for him. And now he had 20 acres of beautiful pasture and lots of friends to hang out with. So why would he want to be caught by me? But my solution for him being hard to catch at the time was the whole idea of make the wrong thing, the right thing easy and the wrong thing hard. So I tried to chase it around a 20-acre pasture. And I remember these moments where I was just like panting and so angry and worked up, because of course, like, I can't run 20 acres as fast as a horse can. So he could get pretty far away from me and then rest. And then I'd just be sitting there panting and angry. And I was just reaffirming the idea that I was a terrible person to be around. So between that and the fact that he would refuse jumps and he really wasn't into jumping, and I didn't have the means of like teaching him how to jump and be less nervous other than just forcing him to do it, I ended up leasing him out and then eventually selling him. And then I started working with off the track thoroughbreds, because the barn that I was at was getting lots of them in and out off the racetrack. And I got the opportunity to start working with them. And then I really loved them. And then at this point, because of access to social media and like different perspectives, and also the shift in my perspective at turnout, I started to soften the types of equipment that I was using. Because as I mentioned earlier, I grew up being taught to use like draw reins, German martingales, twisted wire bits, and having like a bigger bit be the solution to a lot of the problems that we face. And then I started to move towards, okay, I'm not going to use draw reins anymore. I'm not going to use German martingales anymore. I still did use regular running martingales, and I still was inclined with one of my thoroughbreds to use elevator bits and gag bits for jumping, but I was flatting him in a snaffle, and my overall perspective of training and how I approached it had softened a little because of how harsh I was initially taught to be. But I wasn't at the point where I am now or anywhere close to it. So then comes in Milo. So I had this off the track thoroughbred that I loved, and that was my heart horse named Dallas. And my plan was to be jumping with him and working with him and producing him as a show jumper. Unfortunately, he sustained a paddock injury that strained his stifle, and he just never, like, I didn't feel good about jumping him again after it healed because he was just never quite as strong on that leg. And jumping at this point was very much my priority. I wanted to show and I wanted to jump. So I ended up rehoming him. And in hindsight, like, the choice to rehome him in lieu of just keeping him and doing what he could, it was a statement that at that time the sport was something I was more in love with than that horse, no matter how much I loved him, because I did and I still do. And it was a statement of where my mindset was at. However, I don't regret rehoming him because he went to an amazing home where he still is and I still get to visit him. But it absolutely was a statement that the priority to me was jumping, and I didn't want to keep a horse that I couldn't jump. So then after rehoming him, the priority became looking for a horse that I could be riding immediately. So like I was looking at a lot of off the track thoroughbreds. I wanted to be able to ride pretty much immediately, and I wanted to be able to have a horse that I could be taking to small jumping shows within a year. And throughout my searches, I was getting sent ads, and I actually got sent an SPCA ad for the horse that would have been Milo's dad. And it was a thoroughbred. And then I started looking at the other SPCA horses available, and I came across Milo's ad. And there was just something about his ad and like his face that, like, there is this is going to sound so cheesy, but like I swear to God that this is what it is. This is what it was. There was just this feeling that like I needed to go see this horse. I was like, I need to see this horse. There's something, like, I don't know where he is, because on the SPCA website with the horses, it just says that they're in BC. It doesn't say exactly where in BC they are. BC is a very big province. So I had no idea where he was, but I was like, in my soul, I feel like I need to see this horse. And he wasn't at all what I was looking at, because the SGCA actually had him listed as a yearling. And so he was way younger than what I wanted. He was scrawny from being starved, and he was a horse that I would not be able to ride for quite some time. So regardless, I messaged them and I wanted to book an appointment to see him. And sure enough, he ended up being very local to where I was. So he wasn't far away. I wasn't, 1 second, I might sneeze. Sorry. I wasn't gonna have to road trip to go see him, which is something that I was legitimately like, okay, like I'm into this enough that like I will road trip to go see this horse. But I didn't have to do any of that because he ended up being local. And then I went to see him, and I was just like really taken by him. He was really nervous and cautious of people when we first went to see him, and he was like pretty snorty, but very sensitive and very curious, and just had these big, beautiful doe eyes. And there's just something about him that made me really want to see him. And when we booked the appointment to go see him and look at him, they had another showing for another person who was interested in him that was supposed to be coming. And this really bothered me because I was like, okay, well, like, what if I want him? And then there's this other person that's going to have the opportunity to get him, and then they just pick whoever's the most suitable. And then the person no-showed. So by the end of that showing, I got to make my application and get approved. And then adopt him, and then the rest was history. So when I did his pre-purchase exam, that's when we found out that he was actually about 2 years old. The vet told me that he didn't think he'd grow much more than 15 hands, which was way smaller than what I wanted, because I wanted a horse that was going to be 16 hands plus. um, and that was really disappointing to hear, but I just had this belief that he would keep growing, and he did, because now he's 16 too, so he surpassed what the vet thought he would be. But he very much wasn't what I wanted. Like, I wasn't in the mindset where I wanted to work with a 2 year old and take the time that it takes to really build up a horse. And that'll play into like how things go with him, because the priority for a while very much was just like focused on what the end goal was rather than enjoying the journey. So while he wasn't the horse that I had thought I wanted, he was the one that I needed. And I had absolutely no clue the lessons that he would go on to teach me. But like, I am convinced that it was fate, and there is a reason why I felt so pulled to go look at his ad, despite him not fitting the parameters of what I thought I was looking for. However, like within the first week of getting him, there were things that happened that really tested my patience and made me really frustrated, because he was a horse that when I wanted him to do something, I had grown used to being taught that like if a horse doesn't do what you want them to do, you make them do it. Where it's like ask, tell, demand. And then when they don't do it, you make them do it. But when I would get louder and I would apply more pressure and get angry with him, he would get worse. And he was the type of horse where if you really pressured him and made him feel backed into a corner, he would happily square up with you and be ready to strike out and really just react in a way that I'd never experienced before. I'd never had a horse that would actually be willing to fight me if I tried to make them do something they didn't want to do. And that was really, it was scary for me, but it was also very frustrating because I had such a small toolbox that I wasn't sure how to navigate that. And about a weekend, I was like crying and like frustrated, and I was telling my mom that I wanted to send him back, and she's like, "No, you're not going to send him back." And like, mind you, when I got Milo, I was 18 and I had freshly graduated high school, so I was very, very young, and obviously so is he. And it was a learning curve because I'd never experienced anything like this. This photo here on the right with him in the blue halter, you can see how like tense and stressed his eye is in this image. And it's just kind of a look into the internalized stress that he was feeling at the time, but it would grow. So he was only 2 when I got him. So this meant a long period of groundwork and no riding, or at least long for my patient's capacity at the time, because time goes pretty quickly. So initially we did a lot of hand walking, trail walks. Like I would take him to places off property. And like, I really couldn't appreciate to the extent now, like back then I couldn't appreciate it, just how good he was just walking places in hand by himself, and how well he handled a lot of that stuff. I think is something that, had I appreciated it more, I would have recognized just like how brave he was and all of these good traits that he had. And if I'd started the foundational work differently, I could have avoided a lot of the problems that we later ran into. And from the beginning, he had a more species appropriate lifestyle than my Arabian did for most of his life, but I did start to make mistakes. So initially, for the first few months of having him, I had him out on herd turnout where he had lots of horse friends. And he was a little socially inept initially. And my theory for this is that I think that he just didn't learn how to socialize properly because he was starving alongside a lot of other horses. When he tried to nurse, probably his mom would have not had enough milk sometimes, or she would have gotten irritated with him. He probably got chased off of food. And he also probably felt really crappy and didn't really have the ability to bond with horses in the way that he did. But ironically, like his first friend that he ever made was this gray thoroughbred gelding. And like, again, this could just be me projecting, but I think that this is partly why he's bonded so heavily with Pogo, because ever since this gelding that he met when he was just 2 years old, he would live with other horses on and off over the course of years, because he didn't meet Pogo until 6 years ago. Which at what time he would have been 7. So that's still 5 years after this moment with this gray horse. And he just never really fully bonded with horses and was kind of more or less like on the fringes of a herd and never really like developing hard friendships. And like in part, it's probably due to how much I moved him and how much the horses that he did start to bond with would move around. But I do think it's funny that the first real friend he made was a gray thoroughbred, and then his best friend in this world that he's bonded with so heavily, finally, after years of not being like that, is also a gray thoroughbred. But the first big mistake I made with him was that I moved him to a different facility for the winter because I wanted a better arena to train him in. The arena at the place that I had him initially was a bark mulch or like wood chip arena, and it would get really deep in the winter time. So I wanted to move him to a nicer place, the nicer arena. But this place had an individual in and out stall with a shared fence line, and then the paddock was medium sized. It wasn't as small as some of them were. Like it was big enough that he could canter around a little bit, but it was still way smaller than what I would want any of my horses in now. And his interactions with other horses were over a fence line because even in the summertime, they didn't want the horses out together in group turnout. And for such a young horse, this was a really big mistake. And honestly, for any horse, but especially for a young horse that has had a relatively disrupted life or an extremely disrupted life from the beginning and hasn't been able to develop friendships, it was a really big mistake. And it likely contributed a lot to the escalating explosive behaviors that I saw in him in the long run. Like so. So this is him as a 3-year-old when I was doing a photo shoot. This is like a pretty iconic shot because he saw another horse in the bushes because we were at a trail park and spooked, reared up, pulled away from me. And then since we were like off property in a public place, I panicked, as you can see here with me flailing. And then he just proceeded to get abducted by aliens a little bit and then run away. And ran away for, you can see him in the background there as I chase him. And this was pretty iconic, but like this is just an example of like how easily trigger stacked and overstimulated he was. And had he been in a situation where he was out more with other horses and had more capacity to move around and more enrichment, he likely wouldn't have gotten overwhelmed quite so easily, and it would have made it a little bit easier for me to navigate his behavior without having to suppress it so much. And since I made this big mistake, it kind of was one of the first catalysts that set up a pattern of him just being increasingly more stressed, me suppressing his stress with different types of training methods and overlooking it and not treating the cause, and then just having that stress build as a result. So the other thing too is that I was impatient to get going. So as soon as Milo entered his 3-year-old year, I was looking for excuses to ride. I sat on him for the first time in December prior to his 3-year-old year, and then again in March. If anyone commented on how young he was, I would get very defensive and I would just make excuses and I would look for confirmation bias. Like I was the type of person that would seek out those types of studies that are like, oh, look at this study on race horses that says the horses who are started younger are actually sounder long term. But I wasn't looking at them with a discerning eye that was considering all of the factors that are contributing to those findings, and how they're not actually looking long term into the horses long-term like longevity after their racing career. I just really wanted to ride him, and like in the grand scheme of things, sitting on him for a few minutes isn't as damaging as repeated riding, but it was just so unnecessary. Like there was no reason to need to sit on him at the time that I did other than simply just wanting to. And I was just really looking to ride him and just get going as quickly as possible because I was selfishly motivated by wanting to chase those dreams as quickly as I could. And it really wasn't about him. Like it was about what I wanted to do. And I think that's a really important thing to share because the big thing is that a lot of people do this. Like a lot of the excuses we see people make for why they want to ride are just clinging to the human's desires, and they'll make excuses for why they're doing it to try to make it seem like it's horse centered, but that's really not the case. And for me, that wasn't the case. But like something I also want to just reiterate to people is like at this time, I was 19 years old. I was going through a time where I was very insecure, and horses had remained like a constant for me throughout my life. and they had been such a focal point of my identity and who I was, that any attack on my horsemanship and how I showed up for my horses felt like an attack on me as a person. And it made it really difficult to actually critically think and reflect on my actions and what's motivating them, because I was seeking instant gratification. I wanted to chase my goals and get them as soon as possible. And largely, I was feeling like pretty left out of being able to do the types of things that I was seeing friends do with their older horses. But at the same time, I'd made the decision to get a young horse. So there was a lack of accountability on that part. But I do think an important thing to touch on with this is that largely what would have contributed to my lack of change as a human being, and something that can't fully be overlooked, is like the stage in my life that I was at then. And looking back at a lot of these moments, it's sometimes hard for me because I see these photos of me with my horse, but I also remember during those times of my life what was going on outside of the barn and the types of traumas that I was facing, and just how chaotic and disorganized and frustrating and difficult my life was outside of the barn. So then the barn and working with horses was an area of life that I could exercise control, and I could feel like I had some power over something. And it really wasn't fair to my horse, because if I had an especially bad day, I would be more triggered and upset by any explosive or difficult behaviors he demonstrated, and then it would inadvertently get taken out on him. And this was something that was a pattern prior to me getting Milo as well, just because there was so many external stressors in life, and the barn was a place where I could exert some level of control. And that isn't me trying to justify the behavior at all, because there was stuff that I did that was absolutely not fair to my horse at all, and it was just completely unkind and inconsiderate of their well-being. But I want to share that just as a means of people hopefully empathizing with why people get into some of these entrenched mindsets. Um, and it's not to say that you need to justify their behavior or that you shouldn't hold them accountable, but it's also just recognizing the fact that like people are human beings, and there's oftentimes a lot more to the story than just what you're seeing. So there was stuff that I would do with my horses that was definitely irresponsible and not for their well-being in the long term. But it was influenced by how I'd been brought up around horses, the options that I viewed as available to me, because I had such a limited training toolbox, because I really hadn't been taught how to actually problem solve the source of behaviors. And that was coupled with me seeking control in the one environment where I felt that I belonged and where I felt somewhat safe and where I felt I could exert that control to some extent. And it was also a reprieve from the chaos in other aspects of my life. And I don't, this is about Milo, so I'm not going to trauma dump on people in this one, but maybe we'll do a sister webinar to this one about the aspect of trauma and just like people, mental health, and how it impacts how we show up for our horses. So when I did start him under saddle, I started him bitless, but I quickly introduced a bit because that's what everyone does, and I needed it to show. And it just didn't feel like bitless felt like a temporary thing. One thing that I will say is like starting him for the first few rides bitless, I think was a very good decision. And it's something that whenever I'm starting horses under saddle now, I either start them bitless or bridleless, because there's just no reason to add another factor in that they're not used to. And it's a way easier adjustment. If they get nervous and they get wiggly at all, you're not catching them in the mouth, and it's just less invasive. So it's something that I completely believe in. And that was one thing that I guess I did right, was just selecting to start him bitless. But I quickly moved him to a bit, as you can see, because I felt like I needed to. And it was just what everyone else was doing. So here's some images of like the early days of starting him under saddle. And like you can see pretty much right away that he looks very much more comfortable bitless looking back on it. And then also like looking at this now, I see how underdeveloped he was. There was no reason why I needed to be riding this horse. There's this notion that in order to get horses fit for riding, we need to ride them, and that riding is the way to do that. But it's really not. We should be prepping them from the ground as much as possible and starting the riding in really small stints, because it's kind of the same concept as if your end goal is to go for a long through hike or something, and you know you're going to need to backpack with lots of equipment. You're not going to just start out by throwing on a 60-pound pack and just doing the hike like that. But the way we start horses, a lot of times it's like they go from packing no weight to being expected to pack the weight of a rider, walk, trot, canter for extended periods of time very, very quickly. There's no real scaffolding. Had I taken the time to build him up from the ground more first and slowly introduce the riding, even with starting him younger than I should have, because there was no reason to need to be riding him at 3, it would have done him better. Because when you bring them along this quickly and you're introducing weight too quickly, they can't learn to use themselves correctly because they're physically incapable of packing that amount of weight and taking on the weight of a rider in that way. And since they're not fit enough to maintain it for the length and time or the level of strain that we're asking them to, then they have to take a toll somewhere else where other muscle structures that probably shouldn't be getting engaged in the way that they are have to make up for the weakness. And that's what we see with a lot of riding horses, where we end up making decisions to bring them along too quickly that create dysfunction that just builds as time goes on. So the more I asked him to do things and the more I increased the work level, the more I was kind of just adding on to this already flimsy foundational skills. And I could have done his whole 3-year-old year preparing him far better from the ground and just doing stuff with him from the ground to help him and really build up his body so that he's the most capable of carrying me. But I didn't do that, and it would come back to bite me. And then when the winter rolled around again, the lack of turnout complicated things and he started to get more explosive. This video might not play, so I'm just going to quickly end this PowerPoint share and kind of just go to the screen. Let's go. Wait. Because I'm going to show you a video so you can get a taste of what he was actually like. And for OGs who've been here a lot, you've probably have seen these videos. So let's go application windows. Advanced. Okay. Okay, we're going to look at this. Oops. So this is just a taste of like what he was like in the winter time and like just like what types of behaviors we're really going to be talking about, because most of this is going to be photos. But this is literally just me trying to walk next door to use an arena. This is what he was like to lunge, where it was just like these explosive, hyperactive behaviors. Lots of bucking, and like so much of this just stems from him not having enough turnout. And it would have just been able to be largely fixed just by adequately providing him his needs and making sure that he has enough turnout. But you can see that he is just not settled at all. Wait, I don't know why I did that. I still have to share. And this again, in this video, it's going to look like he's not saddle broke, but he was. This is when I was riding him. Yeah, so this is what we were dealing with. And then one more. Okay, wait, no, JK. So we'll stop the share. And then we're going to go back to, oops. We'll go back to the PowerPoint. But yeah, so basically I created a problem by not providing him with his needs. And then it escalated behavior to such a point that we see stuff like that. And then I also started to increase my expectations. And then the increased expectations also resulted in increasing levels of stress, because I was building upon a rickety foundation that wasn't relaxing him and meeting his needs. And then just continuing to add on expectations. So these photos where he's slamming on the brakes, it would be where I'd ask him to canter and then he'd just randomly slam on the brakes. And it looks like I'm hitting him in this left photo. I wasn't. It was just like the angle of my arm. But I would like tap the whip on my boot and also lightly tap his side. So the whip was still serving as a threat, even if I wasn't beating him with it. But this was the reality of the situation where he started to show signs that he was very, very uncomfortable. and he was just not he was just not able to really cope with the demands of what I was doing, yet I still was asking him to do more. Um, and that was a huge mistake on my part, because like I should have slowed down when he was showing me the signs that he wasn't comfortable with things. And then this is why we start to see the stress levels build. And then entering the 4-year-old season, this is where I made a huge mistake, because his whole 3-year-old season, he was barefoot. So because growing up, like all of the show horses that I rode and like all of the people that I knew, horses that were in lots of work were needing shoes. And he did start to get a tiny bit footsore barefoot, but it was something that could have been addressed with hoof boots or just in some other way. But since everyone I knew did shoes, I got him to get shoes on. And the first time he was shod was quite the experience. He was so bad for the farrier because I did not prep him for it at all. He pulled the hoof stand like underneath of him and it clattered everywhere. He was afraid of the being hot shoed and having the shoes burnt on. It was just a really, really unpleasant experience for him. And the farrier, like, and the shoe job was terrible. In the farrier's defense, the only thing I'll say is that like Milo was really poorly behaved, but there's a couple of things. The first thing is that at just coming 4 years old, his coffin bones and his body is far from being done developing. Putting a metal horseshoe onto those underdeveloped little feet is essentially putting on like a brace and impacting and disrupting the growth of that part of the body. Metal horseshoes without frog support also lift the frog off the ground, and the frog making contact with the ground is a very important part of creating circulation through the foot, and removing the capacity to do that can really disrupt and damage the foot. On top of that, as you can see here, he had a really long toe and a low heel. And since he was shod with a really long toe initially, it would just get worse throughout the cycle and we would just see more and more problems going. So this was the start of what would be years long dysfunction of the hooves. And it's one of the biggest mistakes that I've ever made with him, was shoeing him as young as I did and using shoes as a means of trying to mask behavioral problems. And then it was also compounded by the fact that realistically, even as I was seeking solutions for his feet, the priority was to keep him in work and continue riding. So decisions that were being made were centered around keeping him in work and continuing to ride him. And what this meant is that I'm not making decisions based off of what's best for him in the long run. I'm making the decisions based off of what makes him sound for me to ride and allows me to do what I want with him, whether or not it's the best decision in the long run. Because realistically, even if he had needed time off to transition back to barefoot or to rehab his feet or whatever, it would have been a better decision than what I did. You can also see here that there's like some shifts in like the equipment that I used because he was getting so difficult. The shoes being on definitely made his behavior worse. I'm lunging him in a chain here. Still having lots of bucking and stuff. Also, there is like some saddle fit issues and whatnot. And yeah, this isn't a statement to be anti-shoe, just to clarify. It's just that shoeing practices in the horse world have largely remained unchanged for centuries. The fact that metal horseshoes are still considered an industry standard and not using frog support is still considered an industry standard, when there's so much research showing how damaging it has to be, and when there's so much anecdotal evidence of dysfunctional hooves, and to the point where many people don't even know what a healthy hoof looks like because they're so used to seeing dysfunctional hooves. That's really the problem. We're going to get more into the shoeing practices that I used and the solutions that I sought out for his feet, because his feet will be a recurring issue that is a huge component of his behavioral issues. And like for some of the rehab work, we did use shoes, but I wanted to talk about which methods worked best and why I would or wouldn't use them again. But the biggest thing is that I find that a lot of people use shoes as a band-aid, because if your horse is really footsore, you can get a farrier to often shoe them in a way that will mask the pain and kind of numb their feet and will make them appear sound when they're not really sound. So as Milo's hoof issues progressed, he started to need more and more shoeing packages to help rehab and like corrective shoeing to help fix the hoof issue that was created by shoes in the first place. And it got to the point where he needed to wear a wedge pad and a sole pad. And even then, he was still sore walking across big rocks, which should have been a huge red flag, and it wasn't. I was just maintaining this perspective that, oh, thoroughbred types tend to have bad feet. Some horses need shoes, and kind of parroting a lot of the excuses we hear the industry make. So the pressure of wanting to compete as we entered his 4-year-old year added more stress. He was very overwhelmed by the busy environments, and I approached it with a ride him through it mindset and did little to help him relax. So in contrast, it's like if I wanted to take him into these busy situations now, even without changing my methods as much as I had, a really good solution would just have been to hand walk him, to just walk him around the showground, let him graze and let him observe and take it easy and just take my time instead of just like lunging him until he's tired of it, getting on him and riding him in busy warm-up arenas as he stressed and leaped around and got worried, and just continuing to ride him through it until he eventually got tired and stopped reacting. That was a big mistake. As training progressed, new stressors piled on, and I continued to largely ignore existing stress, convinced that it was just Milo being young and spicy and chestnut, which many people within the horse community validated. I initially built my social platforms off of him with how eccentric and explosive his behavior was. That's what drew people to my account initially, was watching him bronc and leap around and be explosive and spicy and dangerous, and watching me stick and ride through it. So a lot of my sense of self and feelings of success as an equestrian were tied to this belief that riding through it and having good stickability and having a good seat and being able to stay on was like the be all end all, and that it was something to be super, super proud of. And that's how I built my self-esteem, and it's something that I felt really good about. And then also, like, when I did have people comment about him being stressed, I would be really defensive, and I would just say, oh, he's just spicy, it's his personality, he does this in the field, he's just playing, he's just excited. And I would make many of the excuses you still see people making today. And I didn't want to look deeper at the problem because I didn't have any other solutions, and I'd had horse stress behaviors normalized to me for more than a decade at this point. So I wasn't really aware of just how deep his stress was. And I was walking around stressed with horses all the time. So I had no real concept of what was normal. And then when we started showing over fences, like jumping was a huge stressor for him. He was so bad for the first couple of years of showing over fences. He would refuse all the time. And I'd go to schooling shows where some of the people were really nice in that they would allow green horses more time in the arena just to get around and use it as a schooling ground. So you wouldn't get buzzed out when your horse refused. But he would be stopping at like even, and you can see these are just cross rails. They weren't big fences. He'd be stopping at most of the fences, and then in between them, he would be bronching and throwing his head down and just freaking out like this. And it was like such a common theme, but it was something that like became kind of a joke and that we would laugh at, and that it was just like funny. And again, I was getting complimented for riding through it. And being like able to be gritty and getting around anyways, despite the fact that what I was doing was just pushing him through a very high degree of stress. I wasn't giving him a good experience. I wasn't giving him any reason to feel good about what he was doing. I was creating a pattern that predicted, hey, when you go into this show arena to jump in a course, it's going to be very stressful. It's going to be very overwhelming. You're going to be forced to do things that make you very uncomfortable. And that's the type of situation I was creating for him and building over time. Someone in the chat has asked any recommendations for sources to read about more about alternative horseshoe methods. The Humble Hoof has a podcast, a Facebook page that's really good. I'll put together a list of people for shoeing stuff after, because there's a lot of people who do a lot of glue-on shoes and alternative methods of shoeing that are fantastic. So the Humble Hoof is one of them. And then there's some, like the Equine Documentalist posts a lot about hooves and does stuff with studies and citations. That's great. That's off the top of my head right now. And they're pretty great. So, but I'll make a list after. But yeah, this was all normalized to me. And also, like, another thing to reiterate is that, like, this type of behavior in horses looking like this over fences and like bronking between fences and just being eccentric and big, it's glorified at the top levels. It's more frowned upon at the lower levels. So people were more likely to criticize me at this level. But then we see people defending pros for the same things and just saying that that's what really good horses and good athletes are like. So it just further serves to normalize the behavior and make people think that this is just a component of working with young horses or working with athletic horses. This photo I blew up because his face in this photo makes me deeply uncomfortable. It's not just the mouth being open, it's like how his eye is the big part that I notice here. The intense glazed over expression, and the tense eye, the really flared nostrils, and the tense lips. Like, I don't see his expression really looking like this much at all anymore, if ever, unless he's like in pain or there's something deeply wrong. And if I did see it, it would be a huge red flag now. But it's really hard to look back at these photos because this is not what he typically looks like. We're gonna do direct comparisons after so you can see the before and afters right side by side. But I just wanted to blow up some of these photos in the meantime. For the person asking with the live recording, this recording is going to be available at the same link. So you can watch it or rewind it at any point after. It'll just be up on my YouTube channel. Okay, so the other thing too is that his hooves continued to be an issue and they were getting worse and more sore over time. You can see here that he's like almost buckled at the knees because he's trying to get weight off of the heel. And this was something where we just started to be like, oh, it's a conformational issue. That's just how he stands. But he was so sore that he would start to just like buckle at the knees to the point where, like, if I went behind his leg and pushed on the back of his tendon, of his cannon bone and just pushed on it, his knee would like buckle. And it was just because his heels were so sore. The wedge pads were crushing his heels were running forward, and being underrun, and then his toe was just growing longer and longer. These are just some more photos throughout the times of showing, and it shows the different types of equipment I used. I picked the figure eight bridle honestly mostly because I just liked the look of it, and it was like a fashion statement, which is a really bad reason to use something, and it also wasn't properly fitted. But you can kind of see like how my equipment was shifting over time, to try more and more different things, but you can also just see how much tension he was holding throughout. These are some more photos where you can see that he's often gritting his teeth and kind of going like this, and his eyes quite tense. There's going to be some more close-ups to look at after as well. Um, so it wasn't that I didn't want to help Milo stressed, it was that I was looking in all of the wrong places. So for his stress it shows, I would try calming paste and supplements. I would try different types of bits, bridles, martingales, and more. For his hoof issues, because his hooves were such that they were creating such a leverage point on his legs that he would chronically have like fill in his ankles and wind puffs in his ankles. And keep in mind, this is like when he's like 4, 5, 6 years old. So he's a young horse. His legs by no means should look better now at age 13 than they did as a youngster. But they do. And it was because the angles of his feet were causing so much strain on his legs that there was fill in the legs. So as a means of trying to address that, I spent so much money on like back on track therapy wraps, IncrediWear therapy wraps, special types of ice boots, like the Ice Vibe boots, for his body soreness and stuff. I would try therapy blankets, all different types of therapy boots, different types of support boots, the Equistreams magnetic bands. Like, I spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars on different types of products that were serving the purpose of trying to help him. But I was looking in the wrong places because I was looking for band-aid fixes that were not actually addressing the cause of the issue. So this is something that I think is lost in this discussion about horse welfare. Is a lot of times these owners are at least somewhat aware that there's a problem and they want to start to fix it, but they often look in the wrong places. And part of the motivation for that is that, like, I didn't want to stop riding him. So I was looking for all of the solutions that would allow me to continue riding him and doing what we were doing and not having to pull him out of jumping, not having to pull him out of work. But I wasn't actually addressing the underlying causes. So I was just slapping a band-aid on a bullet hole, and it might slow the bleeding for a time, but it wasn't solving the issue. And then the issues were just being compounded over time because, of course, the longer you're riding and working a horse on sore feet and the longer their body's compensating for those issues, the more entrenched patterns in the body you're going to see. So his muscular tension from stress and also from physical discomfort just continued to build and build and build. And then we just saw more and more of these patterns building and creating chronic dysfunction in the body. And like I paid for vet work, so also for his feet, like we started x-raying his feet quite early on, and my vet did know like his toe is way too long, his toe needs to come back, he needs the heel to come up. I sent the x-rays to my farrier at the time, and I relayed the information, and I was concerned because the vet expressed concern about risk to the tendons. My farrier responded, I remember this at the time, where he's like, oh well, I should just go tell your vet to do the job. Huge red flag at the time, huge. Should have been a huge, I should have just switched farriers right then. um, but I was really insecure, and then like he also did kind of vaguely say like, okay, like we'll start to work on it, and so that he was going to make a difference, and I wanted to give him the chance to do it. So then you're allowing like a few cycles to happen, and then you're noticing barely any change, or there'll be subtle changes made that aren't actually addressing the problem. Then you get the horse x-rayed again, and you see that there's been virtually no change. And eventually, like I did get new farriers, and I would try new farriers, but the problem largely persisted, where I wasn't being spoken to like I was intelligent by a lot of these farriers, especially the male farriers. And I was being talked down to when I expressed concerns because I think it made them feel insecure when I was questioning their shoeing job. And I also didn't know enough about hooves to really push and argue with them on it. And I felt insecure, and they made me feel stupid. So I just kind of continued to take their word for it. But it was frustrating because it's like I felt that there was an issue. I had a vet validate that there is an issue, and then I was given steps to fix it. But then at every turn, I felt like I was being blocked by the practitioners and professionals that should have been helping me. And it was really difficult. The other thing that I think, like on the side of farriers, that's hard is like when you're working that job as a farrier, there's this expectation that a good farrier is always making the horse sound when they're shod. And if the horse is lame after being shod, that it's the fault of the farrier always. And when you have a horse like Milo who has such chronic hoof dysfunction, he was lame. The shoes masked the lameness, but it wasn't because he was sound. It was because the shoes were being put on in a manner that numbed his feet and kind of numbed the bodily response enough that he could mask the lameness well enough that he didn't appear lame in most settings, but he was lame. No amount of good farrier could have changed the fact that his hooves were so dysfunctional and so incorrectly angled that he was chronically lame. And like a good farrier in like, and like I'm going to use this lightly because I do think that farriers get sucked into the same type of mindset that many trainers do, where in order to retain clients and continue to make a living, like you need to do what people want to do and tell them what they want to hear to some extent, even if you know it's not the best thing. So but a good farrier would have been like should have been real with me, and been like, hey, like your horse's hooves are completely damaged and you shouldn't be jumping in right now. It would probably be best if you would take some time off of riding and do groundwork and just let him time to rehab. But at the same time, I likely would have tried to find a different farrier if they did that, because I didn't want to stop riding. So it's a double-edged sword, but like the biggest thing was that keeping him in work and riding him was the biggest priority. And I wasn't ready to come to terms with the fact that his hooves were so damaged that there wasn't a realistic way of fixing them while keeping him in the level of work that I was doing. And I was also just like feeling very discouraged by looking for help in all of the wrong areas. And then I was also doing body work and whatnot too. But you can't body work your way out of a systemic issue. A body worker could make him feel temporarily better, but when his tension and his bodily pain patterns are stemming from the work that he's doing and such an important structure like the hoof, there again, it's just a band-aid fix because I'm not addressing the actual cause of what is causing him the issues. Had I focused more on body work after addressing the primary cause of the issues, there would have been a lot more of a difference that could have been made. But again, I didn't want to really sink into the mindset of just like focusing on doing those things that would pull him out of work and change the way that I would be able to show up to do the things that I wanted to do. But I think this is the key, is that your farrier can't just snap their fingers and make your horse miraculously completely sound to do all the work you want them to do when there's clear systemic issues. And like a good farrier who's honest and who truly is trying to help the horse and also can afford the potential of lost clients for saying the right things, they should be telling people, look, you shouldn't be riding your horse like this. But again, like I see why they don't. So this isn't criticizing them for not doing that in like, or it kind of is, but I also understand where they're coming from because people need to make a living. So all of these different moving parts are things that need to be considered, because for trainers, farriers, body workers, saddle fitters, all of those people, if they have a client that they know has such a priority on riding that they're unwilling to really take the path that's the best interest of the horse, but would pull them away from their own goals, they oftentimes will try to pick the lesser of the few evils to try to help their client make those decisions and make it a little bit easier of an adjustment. But it's actually doing what you need. So ultimately with Milo's hooves, I saw the most difference when I finally found a practitioner that was real with me, spoke to me like a person, spoke to me like I wasn't an idiot, and took the time to explain. I also want to note that as a trainer, um, this is something that I've experienced a lot with clients, and it's ultimately why I've really stepped back from taking a lot of regular clients, because there is so much pressure to train and work horses through situations that I was not comfortable with and that I did not think were in the best interest of the horse. Because a lot of people don't want to pay you to do groundwork with their horses. They don't want to pay you to do the foundational stuff that looks boring and it looks like you're not doing anything. Because they're chasing these goals with such veracity that they don't want to take the slower path. And then it means you're put in a situation where you often have to take shortcuts or do things that you fundamentally morally don't feel good about. And it takes its toll, because initially when I was starting out training, I didn't really have the capacity to say no, otherwise I wouldn't be able to afford to live. Anyways, initially I opted for equipment like flashes to quiet his busy mouth, because his mouth was so stressed that he was constantly gritting and grinding his teeth and opening his mouth and chewing the bit even at a standstill. So I would use flashes. And this was something that had been super normal to me when I was showing Arabs. Like I used to crank my nose band so tight when I was showing Arabs, and I would always school in a flash, but you weren't allowed to compete in a flash. So when I took the flash off for competition, I would be cranking the cavesson nose band so tightly that like illegally tight, like you couldn't fit any fingers underneath of it. It was terrible, but it was normalized to me. Luckily for Milo, I didn't crank the nose bands that tight, but I still used them. And it was like, once again, a Band-Aid fix where I was just restricting him more and more. Between the flash and the martingale, I was just suppressing these behaviors that were a symptom of stress without dealing with the cause of them. And it was just gagging his outward response of stress and not helping him with any solutions to really cope and address why he was feeling that stressed in the first place. And this is why I don't really advocate for most, or if any, training gadgets and whatnot, because anytime you have something that's promising an immediate fix to a behavior, especially when it's just equipment, it's oftentimes suppressing the behavior rather than actually dealing with the cause of it, unless the purpose of the equipment is to actually treat the systemic issue that's creating the issue in the first place. But when your horse is busy in the mouth, usually it's because of anxiety. And every time you try to take a shortcut, you oftentimes make your long-term path even longer, because you have to backtrack and repair all of the holes in that foundation, and it takes way longer. So both of these things were Band-Aid fixes that really only serve to suppress the symptoms of his anxiety. And you can see how stressed he is in these photos where he's gaping his mouth even with the flash. And he's like, this martingale is pretty loosely fitted, so he really had the head toss to do it. But like even the weight of the rings on the reins, he responded differently with a martingale on than he did without one, because he predicted the restriction and really was uncomfortable with it. But throughout all of these moments, the other thing to note is that I was still able to have moments riding in bridleless, like this right photo. And like I even like competed him over fences bridleless and stuff. So it's not that he was always this bronking, freaking out mess, even though he still did that bridleless sometimes. So I want to reiterate the idea that it's not like this whole time was just all these horrendously awful moments where he was always being bad. The point is that they were far more present than they should have been. And despite the fact that I could ride him bridleless, he still wasn't relaxed. So I think the reason why he was as good as he was bridleless is because it was a reprieve from all of the restrictions and equipment. And even then, we still saw stress behaviors come out. So then his bucking was such a problem that one year he even broke my hand because he threw his head down to buck so hard that my knuckles slammed into his neck and it broke the little small outer bone on my hand. And it happened while we were at a show. So I ended up competing in a cast because I didn't want to scratch the classes and end up having to pay for a show that I didn't get to compete at. But this is just an example of just how incredibly stressed he was. Okay, there's another video, so I have to change how I'm sharing this yet again. And we'll go to here. Okay, sorry guys, back over here. And then I have to skip to the one that I want to show you. This is the last video that I have on here. Also, all of these videos are still up on my channel if you want to watch them. You have to go looking, but like this is one of him younger where he kind of did a lead change to try to go towards the horse who was lunging and then fell. And he was, again, probably because of the hoof issues. This is me with my broken hand and him bucking after a fence. And then this is him just refusing, me falling on his neck. And it's like a very small jump, you can see. And then these were the types of things that we dealt with on a pretty regular basis where he would just be bronking after fences. And the bucking after fences, I do firmly believe was related to how sore his feet were. And wait, one thing to note there with the refusal, this is like one of the things that I think is crazy because despite how much I was pushing him through stuff and how much I was stressing him out, one thing that was still controversial that I remember for posting online is that when he'd refuse, I wouldn't get mad at him and I would pet him after, and people would say that I was rewarding him for his refusal. And that was one of the things that I actually did right, in that I wasn't trying to stress him more in that immediate moment by getting mad at him. But it shouldn't be that controversial to pet your horse when they're scared. So I included these ones of him jumping bridleless just to once again reiterate the idea that it's not like he was always being bad. There was moments where he was doing things that a lot of people's horses can't do. But it doesn't change the fact that he was still incredibly stressed and his feet were sore. But he was still trying to do the right thing and being like a willing partner despite that. But there was all of these moments of these really high levels of stress and bronching, and just really explosive behaviors where it would take very little to set him off, especially off property at shows. It was like riding a coiled spring or like a dynamite that was ready to go off. And it was just a lot where he was doing these things often enough that it was a problem. And it doesn't matter how much I was able to ride him bridleless in different types of settings, it was still a chronic issue. And these were just the types of things that I came to just associate with his personality and his behavior, and just as something that was just part of who he was and his quirks. When looking back at it, it's like I see all this tail swishing, I see this bronching, I see this pulling, and I see just massive signs of discomfort where he's just so upset. And randomly exploding, and he was trying to tell me something, and he had to get this loud because I was ignoring the earlier signs of what he was trying to tell me. And it was just like constant. And again, like there was always moments where it's like, okay, he could be good in certain moments, but it was like this was just happening way too often, and it was way too much. And there's just so many repeat moments of him doing stuff like this where he was trying to say like a hard no to things. Here he goes like kind of bucking the whole way around the arena, and I'm trying to stop him and he's not stopping. And this was just kind of what the reality was for how he was for many, many years. And a lot of it was related to hoof pain. So it was a systemic issue, but it was so repetitive and just not what we should be normalizing in horsemanship. But again, a part of this that made this such a prevalent issue is the fact that so much of this was normalized, where a lot of my upper level role models and idols were riding around on horses who would do similar behaviors. And then it's like, okay, well, if my horse is doing that, that's fine. Or I would have people just be like, this is part of having a young horse. This is just what a young horse is. And yeah, like a lot of people did say that he was just being naughty and that he just needed to be put in his place. I distinctly remember there's one clinic I went to, and I'm not going to name the clinician, but he was doing what he does where he bucks after fences, and they literally said like lean back and rip his teeth out. And I didn't listen because that didn't feel good to me. But it's like, that's like the bar is on the floor. That was like my version of being like considerate of his feelings, was not pulling too hard on his mouth. in situations like that, not hitting him after refusals. And I still put him through all of these moments. Like the photos from this cross country photo shoot used to be ones that I was super proud of, but now I see lots of tension in them. And he was just very explosive and worried all the time and having these big moments. And it's not that, like, when I talk about things like these, I'm often met with the response where people are like, oh, well, you can't just expect horses to be robots and never react to anything. And that's not the expectation, but it's like, what type of reactions do we want to normalize? Because we shouldn't be normalizing degrees of stress like this as like a regular occurrence. And we could also recognize the fact that horses aren't robots and that they're feeling beings, while being honest with ourselves about what their emotions and what their behaviors are saying. Um, and that's the thing, is it's like horses aren't robots. They do have moments. Like, he's still going to have moments of stress in his life today. You can't completely avoid stress, but there's a huge difference from recognizing the fact that you cannot completely avoid stress and making no effort to mitigate stress where you can, and making no effort to listen to your horse. And that was largely what the reality was with him, where I wasn't listening. So he had to get louder and louder. And I also wasn't taking alternative pathways when he was showing that he was overwhelmed. And so much of my identity as a rider and how I learned how to feel good as a horse person was about how well I stayed on him and how I could sit through his bucks. So there was also this component of pride that I felt about being able to ride through those things. And honestly, like, it got the most views. So the other thing too is, on social media, people are being further reinforced for these types of videos and having horses like this, because they get a lot of views and they get a lot of attention, and they get a lot of people thinking that you're a spectacular rider because you can ride through those things. And this isn't to downplay the fact that, like, sure, it's a cool skill to have, to be able to have a sticky seat. However, nowadays my perspective has shifted to the point where it's a lot cooler to be able to train in a way where you're able to avoid those situations anyways. Wow, there's like a, sorry, I got distracted because there's like a melanistic um squirrel outside, like a gray squirrel. It's way lighter than it should be. But yeah, like, it's way cooler to be able to avoid these types of situations in the first place and train in such a way that you're not inducing these levels of stress. And it looks a lot more boring. And when you do it right, people just assume that you just have nicer, more easy, and more calm horses, when that's not the case. Um, this photo on the right here, his eye and like the intensity of his eye and just how uncomfortable he is really hard to watch. And then we have this one where he's upset going into the water and he throws his head. What you'll notice though is that he's not wearing, or leucistic is what I meant, yeah, where he's not wearing a martingale and stuff, and he's still in a snaffle. And so it's like, I've softened a lot of my equipment, but he's still very upset because the equipment was just part of the issue. And then we have videos of, or photos of him flatting at home where he just looks very upset. And Gremlin meows when he has his fish and he's trying to show it. So he's just yelling in the background. I promise he's fine. So he's in like a soft rubber bit and like he's wearing very little equipment, but he's still very much not relaxed. And we even saw these explosives at home where he's just chronically having this look of tension and these ears that are turned back and looking upset, where they stay in like the outward, wide at the tips of the ears, like position that's on the equine grimace scale. So ew, there's a, why are they putting ice ads on my live? I need to change, I need to look at ad settings if that's happening. That's fuck ice. Anyways. And then this is another photo shoot that we did where again, he's like really stressed and unhappy and we're just cantering around a field here. And again, we are just doing a photo shoot for fun, and we're still getting a lot of these stress behaviors. So we're going to go through a series of photos from over the years where you can just kind of see varying degrees of stress and tension. And the main things we're looking at are like the flared nostril tension, the prominent chin, and then the eye tension where his eyes are like widened and there's this hard glazed over stare and you can see a peak above the eye, and then also the grimace of the face. And like one thing I want to note too is that like back during these times, like I was doing a lot of photo shoots, I was taking a lot of videos, and I was just documenting so much of what he did. So during these times where he was the most stressed was when I was the most active on social media and really trying to play the role of like moving up the levels and doing stuff like this with my horse. And so I have tons of photos like this, and they're hard to look back on now. In this photo, he's wearing a leather snaffle bit, which was better, but you can still see his mouth is quite unhappy. And this was during a time where his refusals were getting less frequent, where he wasn't stopping at fences and he was getting around more, but you can still see that he's quite stressed. And this was around the time where I eventually met his now trimmer, who started to help me address his hooves. But here we're still seeing like a lot of mouth tension where his mouth is gaping. And I've had a lot of people comment on the fact that they're like, oh, he's just gaping because you're being rough with your hands. But it's like I could be riding on the buckle and he'd still be chewing on the bit, because he just simply didn't want the bit in his mouth. And also to note is that I always rode with a whip, and it wasn't because I was actively beating him with it, but it's because I needed that whip as like a threat to keep him going forward. Otherwise, he wouldn't want to go forward to canter, and he'd be really sucked back and backed off. So for years and years and years, I was really reliant on using a bit. And then you can see here in this bridleless photo too, he's looking stressed as well. So again, it's not just equipment. I think when I initially made this post about his behavior, a lot of people took it as like just a statement of like the bit is the only problem. But no, the photos that I've used to document, especially when we go to look at the after photos, it's largely just that the purpose of it is to document the shift in perspective, and the difference in like my own body position and where he is. This right photo here isn't what I would consider an after photo because it was still during the time where he was the most stressed. But I wanted to show all the different equipment that I've used, because it's not that I was always using harsh, overbearing equipment. Like I would try to go without a noseband. I would ride in different types of bitless bridles. What I will say is, looking back, consistently the bitless options were ones that he looked less stressed in. So I do think that like overall the bit was a source of stress for him, and it was much more invasive. And then we have more photos here where it's like you can see the grimacing, the stress in his face. We're stopping and refusing, and just all in all looking unhappy. And then here with the bitless photos, you can see that he looks the least tense as what he does in like most of the photos that we've seen, because there's just this degree of stress. And yeah, so it's just been like really a big shift in like all of these different types of equipment and whatnot that I've been using. So now we're going to get into the hoof issues. So you can see in this photo of his feet that he's got really puffy ankles. And this was something that was a recurring theme for like the whole time he was shod like this. You can see that he's got a wedge pad. His heels, like if you look at the back end of the heel, you can see this area where the coronet band connects to the back of the hoof. This is called the digital cushion, and it's super atrophied and degraded compared to what a healthy hoof should look like with healthy digital cushion. And that's because his feet, he wasn't having adequate frog support. He was creating a leverage point with this long toe and the low heel. And he just like, so the really important shock absorbing components of the hooves were not working properly. But I didn't know what healthy hooves looked like. And I had thought that this was normal. The other thing to note too is that like as a horse who was deprived of adequate care, as a baby, he was already probably at a disadvantage because he would have like, he was still regaining his nutrition and building up his hoof health in a way that he should have done much earlier in life. And that definitely disadvantaged him, but that's not an excuse because there's steps that I should have taken to consider that. Okay, so shoeing Milo at 3 and it being a terrible job set him up for failure. He continued to be failed by myself and hoof care professionals. This dramatically impacted behavior, but also highly likely contributed to a minor tendon injury that he had 1 year. I tried to express concerns with multiple farriers and was often brushed off or made to feel stupid. It took a while to find a farrier who not only noticed the issues, but took the time to explain to me what they were and how to identify them. And the time that was taken to actually explain to me like what the problems with his feet were, because she was very polite about it. But I remember when she was first looking at his feet, because I got her actually as a fill-in farrier before we were going to a show because he needed back shoes with studs on. To go and compete on grass. And she was looking at his feet and she's like, oh my God, like, and just like really, she's like, who's been doing his feet, and was just like asking questions and was concerned, and was like, well, I can't work on this right now, otherwise he's not going to be able to be sound for your show. But like, these are the problems that he has in his feet, these are the issues. And then I asked her a little bit about what she would do to fix them, and what the problems were, and she took the time to explain it to me, so I felt more clear about the path ahead. And it kind of opened my eyes to the issues that we were seeing and provided more clarity that I needed, and she'd taken the time to explain things in a way that made more sense. So we tried a lot of different hoof fixes as we started to address rehabbing his feet. So the first was the steel shoe, heel wedge, and sole pad. He was still sore on big gravel, even with all of that, which just speaks for how sore his feet were. Then we did a pour in pads, which is basically like this jelly kind of substance that you pour in and it sets, and then it's just like a pad that's like exactly formed around the foot, so it does provide frog support. And then a steel shoe, and then we also tried hoof casts, Forma hoof, Duplo shoes, and then we tried different types of glue-on shoes like the Easy Care Versas, hoof boots. I've tried scoop boots, Cavallos, scoop boots, and flex boots. Scoop boots so far are my favorites. And then also transitioning in barefoot. But initially, like, he was crippled if we tried to pull the shoes off completely. Like, he looked like a horse who is actively foundering. He could not walk sound, even remotely sound, even on the softest footing, like grass. He was so sore. So it just wasn't feasible to have him go completely barefoot from the beginning. So we tried a lot of different things. Out of the things that we've tried now, like if I was doing the same thing again, I would approach it differently. I would probably start with the glue-on shoes with frog support and just do those and stop nailing into the feet at all, and use that as my primary rehab. Is just picking a good glue-on shoe with frog support and calling it a day and having those go on, because those worked the best. Hoof casts were okay. He wore through them quite quickly, and they kind of failed and fell off more often. Forma hoof was a good idea in theory, but it's very expensive, and we had issues with the canisters failing. And per canister, it was like $30 a canister, and I think you used 1 to 2 of them per foot. So very expensive, and then the mold was like $500. Very expensive, and didn't work as well as what I would have wanted to. Duplo shoes are good. I do think they have glue-on options, but we use the nail-on kind, which you can see in this photo that's kind of in the bottom middle section. But overall, like, the shoes that I've used that have been my favorite have been the Easy Care Versas, because they've stayed on really well and they've helped improve his hoof health. So for the question about asking if Milo has these issues or is he fully healed now, we've had ups and downs. Like, I think the thing about hoof rehab is it's not going to be linear in a lot of cases unless it's a relatively simple fix, because a lot of times you're trying things that you're not sure how it's gonna function and how it's gonna work. And then the shoes failing and falling off can set you back. Changes in weather can set you back. The other thing is that when they've been sore for so long, their body has compensatory patterns that are going to make it more likely for the hooves to stay in a certain way, just influenced by how they stand. So it's a process of not only like fixing the hooves and getting them more comfortable so they start standing and moving more correctly, but also altering those compensatory patterns and letting their muscles and bodies heal. So for him, there was a lot of ups and downs, and we're going to get into one of the major downs, because initially his hoof rehab was going pretty well and he was doing pretty well and I was riding again. And then we had a major setback that was super disappointing and set us back for like 2 years or more. And then this recent year, he had a metabolic flare up over the winter. And there's a few reasons why I think that happened. I actually forgot to put one of the photos in here that I wanted to share, because it was an injury that he had last winter that impacted how much he moved around. And then I also think the sugar tests on the hay we were feeding weren't accurate, and they had higher sugar than we thought. And then he gained a bunch of weight and had a metabolic flare up, and then his feet were sore again. So then we did several cycles of glue on shoes, and they're doing much better now, and he's barefoot again now. So yeah, it like hoof issues are really, they can be difficult to fix, because you can have to try different avenues, and also finding the right type of help can be difficult. And then also the diet plays a huge role as well. So dietary changes take time, and then also keeping in mind that growing out a whole new hoof capsule takes about a year. So even if you did like everything perfectly from day one and it's all working perfectly from day one, you're looking at about a year until you have a whole new hoof grown out. But then it's like throughout that, you're probably going to have differences in posture and changes in posture, and also nutrition that can impact the way that the hoof grows in. So this is him jumping post shoe removal. Once he got his shoes off and he started to rehab to be more comfortable, he was jumping more correctly. He also was not bucking as much after fences, and his refusing basically almost completely stopped. So a lot of the refusing of fences, I think, was pain related. Part of it was being afraid of the fences themselves. But yeah, you can see here that it's like barefoot, he was jumping really well, and he was barely refusing, huge change in behavior, and it was really great. And then we got all these. So this is like the last showing environment that he's done since 2020. And it was like shortly into his hoof rehab, and he was doing really, really well. However, you can still see like this is the one and only time I've worn spurs on Milo, which is pretty embarrassing. And it's because I got a sponsorship for tech stirrup spurs, and they wanted me to like shoot a photo of them, and they were like they're rounded blunted spurs, so they're not as aggressive as they could be, but he did not need spurs. And it was just stupid, and you can still see that he still has facial tension, and he's like not completely relaxed. It's still miles better than what it used to be, and we weren't seeing as many explosive stress behaviors, but the tension is still there, as you can see here. And a lot of it's bit related tension. This is a leather bevel bit. And yeah, so still got some tension there. So starting Milo's hoof rehab meant riding couldn't be prioritized in the same way, especially initially. This became especially true after I continued working with him through the rehab. And initially he was doing really well until the trail ride from hell happened. And this is something that to this day is like another huge regret of mine, because it set him up for so many issues that took a long time to rehab. And I'd already spent years expending his emotional piggy bank and putting it into overdraft by asking way too much of him and ignoring his needs and ignoring his stress behavior. And then this kind of just took it over the edge, where it's like I completely depleted his emotional piggy bank and put it into overdraft and really damaged his body. So we're going to get into that in a second. Just quickly referencing the chat. How's Banksy's foothold doing? I'm going to have a video of that I'll do soon, because we just kind of trimmed the toe off because it was splitting. And I can show what that looks like. But yeah, examples like that is like Banksy having a huge abscess over the summer means that his hoof capsule has to take like the year to grow out basically, and it's halfway grown down, and then it'll be a normal hoof after, because his feet have been growing really fast. But something like that can set up a situation where the hooves are going to have signs of having problems for a long period of time, even after the issue has been resolved. And yeah, regarding the photos, people would say that he's happy because his ears are forward, but ears are more of an indicator of where the horse's attention's focused. So he's looking at the jumps, but that doesn't mean he's relaxed. A lot of people would also claim that this is a focus face, but having seen how he looks in different settings with lower attention, I don't think it's focus. And I'm also really cautious of buying into the notion of the focus face, because I find that it's used to justify really high degrees of stress. And there's little evidence that this is the case. So the trail ride from hell was the straw that broke the camel's back. And there's a little bit of a GoPro video of this from October 31st, 2020 on my YouTube channel, because it was a Halloween trail ride. At this point, he was in Formahoof as part of his hoof rehab, and he was doing pretty well enough to go on a trail ride. And basically the gist of it is I took them to a park that I'm not familiar with, because someone I was riding with at the time suggested it and said that she grew up there and she knew it really, really well. And that it was like a beautiful place to ride, and that she knew all the trails like the back of her hand. And my mom and I went, and we believed her. And the plan was to go for like a 1 hour trail ride, short trail ride. And basically, long story short, is very clearly this person did not know the trails as well as she thought she did, and kept saying that she knew where we were going, despite the fact that like we were unsure, and the trails were getting increasingly more demanding, and we were riding like through a mountain ridge on like a tiny, narrow, single file line with like a huge drop off to the edge of the ravine on the other way. So it hit a point where once it was very apparent that we were lost and she did not know where we were going, that we couldn't turn around because it was too narrow to turn around. And it was a situation where what was supposed to be like a 1 hour ride went to like 5 hours. And there was a point at which where I had to turn Milo loose to help my mom and Pogo, because Pogo was so exhausted because he was not fit for this. And she was leading him on the ground, but he was like scrambling and having a hard time getting down the ridge. And it was just such a horrible situation and really frustrating because it was putting trust into someone who said that they knew where they were going and lied about it. Um, and whether you're hiking on foot or on a horse, if you get the feeling in the pit of your gut that the person you're with does not actually know where they're going, go with it. Don't believe the person, because this trail ride caused substantial damage to my horse. He ended up wearing completely through his forma hoof molds. So he was just walking around on his bare feet on these big mountain rocks and ridges. And they had gotten so worn down that they lacked traction at one point, and he was sliding and he was scared, and he was uncomfortable, and he was so stressed. And we were just trying to desperately get down off of this mountain ridge and just get down onto flat, safer ground. And we had been riding for like 4 hours. It was starting to get dark. And there is this very real possibility of getting stranded on the side of a mountain. And like with horses, it's like it was a forested area. They can't airlift you or do anything to get you out of there. So it's like we need to get down. Otherwise, these horses could be severely impacted. And eventually we got down to like a flat portion and off of the really dangerous portion. And then we got to this area, which I photographed this. It's like this gate area. And they build a lot of these similar entrances for horses to try to prevent motorized vehicles from going in. But this one was like a 90-degree turn, and it was really, really narrow, and it was barely long enough for like a pony to turn around in, much less a regular sized horse. And something about Milo is that he's really claustrophobic, and he is really nervous of narrow doorways. So the narrowness of this whole thing was a huge source of stress, and he was already at his limit. His feet were sore. He'd worn through his hoof molds. It was so narrow that I had to untack him and take his saddle off and try to lead him through like in a bridle. And there was no other way around because there's also a gas pipeline that was too wide and too big to jump, and it was also covered in bush. And then on the area where it kind of went over a ridge and it had a gap underneath of it, the gap was too low for a horse to walk under. So the only way out was to either get him through this gate or ride back the way we came, which was not an option. So it was a situation where I had to basically just be like, you have to do this. And he really didn't want to go. He was really stressed. And I had to keep asking him to go. We had the other two horses on the other side of the gate, and he was so beside himself in stress. And he finally did it. And by the time he got through, he was so stressed that he was like jigging on the spot. He was doing like, he does this jaw thing, usually only when he's eating at like around feed time and he is predicting food coming, where he's just like going like this and just like moving his jaw and like, did it the whole way back, jigged the whole way back, was just so fucking stressed and just like completely fried. He was completely fried. His hooves were completely worn through. He was probably super bruised in the foot and just so fucking stressed. Like fried the whole way back to the trailer, just completely beside himself in stress. And I felt terrible because this is not a situation that I willingly put him through. And to answer the question in the chat, no, I did not stay friends with this person. I stayed friends with her for a bit after that, and then other stuff came up that completely dissolved the friendship. But this was like one of the first huge red flags that I should have listened to because it was just so dangerous. And we are so lucky that it didn't go worse. Like truly so lucky, because one of the horses could have fallen into the ravine. Someone could have gotten hurt. We could have gotten stuck on the side of a mountain in the middle of nowhere. And like, it was just so dangerous. And that's why it's like the video that I did post is like a very small portion of that trail ride, because I stopped filming on my GoPro because we were so stressed. And like my poor mom was so stressed because she started feeling like we were lost way sooner than I did because I trusted the friend too much. And like my mom wanted to turn back way earlier, and I wish that I'd listened to her. But basically this moment was one where it's like I depleted his emotional piggy bank after years of ignoring his stress. And this was during a time where I was being more considerate of him. I was doing the work to try to make things better for him. I was using more and more positive reinforcement and just really trying to show up better for him. And then I did something that just completely destroyed the trust that I had in him, hurt his body, and created lasting issues. And it was a situation that like I still regret to this day. I wish it could have been different because I think it set us back a lot. So I also injured his body, and he was so stressed that he got grade 3 stomach ulcers, and it was to the point where he like didn't want to move forward at all anymore, like anything that even resembled work. He was very uncomfortable, and just didn't want to do anything. Like I gave him quite a bit of time off after this ride, and then when I did try to start riding, he like wouldn't even go forward at the walk. He was just like, no, I'm not going to move. And like I'd hit the point where it's like I don't want to just keep adding pressure and trying to make him go or using a whip. And he was like pinning his ears and tail swishing and just like so pissed. So we treated him for ulcers, and I gave him time off. But then like after this, his hooves were severely damaged, and he had long lasting bruising. That was like deep bruising in the sole, probably from wearing through his forma hoof molds, because at this point, like his hooves were nowhere near completely rehabbed. He still had incredibly thin soles, and then having to walk on mountain terrain with no protection just completely decimated his feet. So this began a lengthy journey to earning back his trust and comfort yet again, when I still hadn't even fully done that in the first place. And what this looked like was completely restarting his hoof rehab, but from a worse standpoint, because he had an injury to the hoof now, basically like chronic bruising, where he was just so sore and so uncomfortable, and he didn't want to do anything. And like even when I tried to do liberty work with him with like the highest value food rewards possible, he like opted out of doing anything with me. He wanted nothing to do with me for like a full year. And this was like so freaking devastating. It really hurt my feelings. It messed with my self-esteem. And it made me feel terrible. But like a huge component of this was not forcing him to engage with me anyways, because that was just feeding into the same mindset that created a lot of these problems in the first place, where he'd been forced to do things and he'd had his needs overlooked, and he was just made to be exceedingly more and more uncomfortable because of that. So letting him say that no and opt out of training and not making him do stuff for as long as I did was actually a key component of this. Oh yeah, this is actually one more video that I have to show you, but this is an example of just how freaking stressed he was, because it was freaking terrible. Like it was so bad. And it's really hard to look back like to this. It still kind of ignites a stress response in me to watch these types of videos. But this is an example of him being bridleless me in the arena, and I was just trying to vault on, and you can see him saying a hard no, and I'm scratching him. He's moving away. He's saying no. And he starts to pin his ears, and he's like, hard no, tail swishing's going. And that's basically what we were dealing with. And it was just repeated over the course of time where he didn't want to do anything. He's just like, my body is so sore. I've had such a negative experience. I want nothing to do with this. And like I really can't blame him for that, because like it was a completely justified response based off of what I'd put him through. And he was probably having lasting body soreness like to his feet, and then also from the feet being sore, lasting body soreness from that as well. And he just super miserable for a long time, and it took a long time to buy that back. So now we're going to look at the before and afters. So these bridleless photos were taken after like almost 3 years after the whole debacle with the trail ride, because like honestly I basically had to give him a full year mostly off, because he was so unhappy. And like I periodically would try to work with him, and we do a little bit of things. He was just so uncomfortable and unhappy and sour, and like his perspective towards riding had just shifted so much, where it was just like a really hard no. And in the past with the explosive behavior, like if he'd actually been listened to, he probably would have been more inclined to say that hard no and not be as explosive in his behavior. But since I'd been listening to him more lately, he was saying a really hard no, and I also wasn't as comfortable putting the pressure on to create that yes. So it really shifted how he started to respond to training when he didn't want to do it, where he'd just be like, no. And it was like so much work to get the feedback, and to the point where like we weren't seeing progress in the way that we should have. So I ended up paying like $4,000 to do an MRI on his problem foot, which is the right front. And the MRI came back with like very normal findings outside of the fact that it found deep bruising in his foot. And I believe the MRI was done a full year after the initial incident with the trail ride. So he was still suffering from deep bruising from that. And I'm still doing updated hoof rads. So I'm going to probably do some more in the spring or the summer after he's gone through the winter. And see where we're at now. But like, it has been a really long time trying to repair the damage that was like, there was already damage from the years of ignoring the hoof health and stuff, but we were actually on a pretty good track initially with how his feet were doing in rehab. And then that ride set us back immensely and basically had to restart the rehab from ground zero, but honestly almost worse, because at least with his shoes, his soles were somewhat protected and he didn't have to like sustain the amount of damage he did. But it was also just such an unpleasant experience physically and mentally that like he was completely fried. So it took a long time to get back. So anyways, I've selected these photos to show people the difference in his faces. And I did the post that on Facebook that inspired this discussion was comparing these photos. And a lot of people sought out to defend his expression in the top photo and try to make excuses like, oh, it's completely different context. He's working in the top photo and not in the bottom. Different equipment, like he's just playing in the bottom photo. You're not really doing anything. He's not being asked to work. And those responses I found really interesting, because the only thing I could think of that people were assuming that he was not working in the bottom photo is because he's bridleless, and also because I'm not like actively holding on a contact of his face. He's doing the exact same things in both photos. He's cantering at approximately the same speed. He jumped a couple of logs at the beach. He had to hack down to the beach on a trail. So he's doing the same things, but the perception that it's a job because he's wearing more equipment in the top. And some people also assumed that he was competing, so they tried to use that as an excuse too. And it was really interesting to watch, because people were basically trying to argue with my reality and add context that wasn't actually there to try to justify the expression in the top. He's working in both photos. He's actually working more correctly in the bottom photo. He's just not pulled into a frame. His nose is poking out, which is most horses' preference if you allow them to carry themselves how they do. And the nose poking out doesn't impact their use of their back in the same way, in any real way. Like, we have this fixation on head position when it doesn't actually mean that they're engaging their core or doing anything. And in the top photo, we see an intense expression. We see really tense eyes, a tense nose, flared nostrils, clenched teeth, and just overall very stressed. And then that was coupled with how he was actually behaving during that ride, where he was bucking and striking and very nervous. And like, if you look at the difference in his eye, especially in the bottom photo, he's very soft, and like his eye is soft and expressive, and he's focused and he's paying attention to what he's doing, but he's not really tense. And then I also chose to compare these photos because he's bridleless in both, but the top photo shows a high degree of tension, even bridleless. You can see he's clenching his jaw more. He has a more pronounced chin. His eye is much more tense, and he has got a far more intense expression. And yeah, there's a lack of equipment, which people might be like, oh, they can't use the excuse if he's not working in one of these photos, because he's literally at the same beach doing the same thing. And I remember this top beach photo shoot, and there was a time where I actually got kind of mad at him, and I did smack him with the whip that I still feel guilty about, because he didn't want to go through seaweed. And instead of just getting off and like asking him to follow me, which he would have, I had this moment of ego where I was like, no, you have to do this. And I reverted back to practices that I had initially used. And I still feel guilty about it today. It's something that I'm very ashamed of, because it was just such a poor reaction. And it didn't make the beach a pleasant experience for him at all. It just added stress, and I got mad at him for a normal response for a flight animal to have. And instead of making his life easier and just getting off for a couple of minutes and walking him through stuff, I chose to throw a human temper tantrum and get mad at him. And that was the wrong decision to make. And it's something that I'm ashamed of, and I haven't actually publicly admitted of, because I've been so ashamed of it. But I think it's important to note that it's like, when you're making these systemic changes and changing how you approach handling horses, there's going to be moments of stress or what, or where you just revert back to old habits, because you can't just do a 180 shift and never make the same mistakes again. I think the key is catching when you're making mistakes, or catching, ideally practicing catching your mindset earlier when you feel yourself start to become frustrated, um, and no longer pushing when you're feeling frustrated, like getting off, taking a break, not pushing for more stuff, and just taking a deep breath, relaxing, not pushing through it. Because if you catch yourself earlier at the onset of stress, you're less likely to snap back to these impulse reactions where you're acting out of frustration. So it's about noticing those earlier moments and not responding in frustration, rather than expecting there to be this perfect shift to being a completely different person when you've been in the habit of being really forceful and pushy with horses. So it's not about perfection. It's not about expecting people to never make mistakes, but we can't call something a mistake if we're actively justifying it. We can't call something a mistake if we don't view it as an issue. We can't call something a mistake if we're downplaying it. And when I posted a lot of these photos, what I was met with was a lot of people excusing what they were seeing in the top photos and defending me and my actions in the top photos. Or on the flip side, we had people being like, oh, the horse was fine. The issue was your hands. That's the only problem. It's that it's not the equipment. It's not the bit. It's not the horse. It's you. And the interesting thing about it is that the entire point of the post was talking about how I contributed to his behavior, yet people still felt the need to go out of their way to blame me, but then also insinuate that the horse was not stressed, or that the only source of the stress was because of me. And like my hands, when in reality it was a bunch of different moving parts. These photo comparisons were to serve the purpose of showing the difference between a systemic change, because in this top photo I had him shod on the fronts with the wedge pads and the sole pads, and I was also operating with a mindset where I was making him do what I wanted and just riding through his stress, and that was what the priority was. So the difference in these photos is not just the equipment. The equipment's a small part of it. It's the whole change in the way that he was kept, in his living situations, his diet, because in these top photos he was still on a grain-based diet, and he also wasn't getting as much turnout as he was in the bottom photo. And then there's also the aspect of the equipment and the shifts in training, where I started to allow him way more choice in the bottom photos. I started to reward him for doing what I wanted him to do, instead of punishing what he was doing wrong or only using pressure and release. So these photos are representative of a systemic shift. It's not just the equipment, but I think that me posting these comparisons brought out defensiveness in people, and then they sought to try to justify the before photos because they saw themselves in them. And in these, like in the photos with the bit, in all of these photos, he's wearing a snaffle bit. This one's a rubber French link, or like a snaffle with a peanut in the middle. So it's not a particularly harsh bit, but he's just not comfortable in the bit. And it wasn't just when there was contact, it was even at rest. Like he very clearly just was more stressed in a bit. And again, I've had people try to be like, oh, well, it's not the bit that's the problem. It's the way you introduced it, which maybe that's true, but it's also much more invasive than riding bridleless. And if I have, or bitless, and if I have him happy right now with what he's doing, what reason is there to force the bit when there's no real purpose to do that? There's no real need to do that. If he has a history of stress with it and it is not a necessary piece of equipment, why is there such a fixation on people trying to pressure me into using a bit on him when he's much more happy and comfortable in the equipment that I'm using now? And that's something that I think is really telling about the industry, where people get pigeonholed into these mindsets of tradition and what they want to use and what they want to normalize being used with their own horses. They try to pressure other people into doing that. But whether or not it would be possible to get him as relaxed in the bit as he is bitless and bridleless, what is the purpose in doing that? Like, who is that for? Because I don't think it's for him. I don't think it's for him. It's for the interests of the riders and perpetuating this industry standard of using a bit. And there's a lot of information that people share about bits and claims that they make about bits that are not currently substantiated by any real empirical evidence. Like there's this belief system that horses can only properly carry themselves in a bit, but there's no real research that supports that as a true fact, as the only reality. Because also when we're watching horses completely at liberty, with the exception of horses who have very dysfunctional bodies, which for many of them are caused by human interference, most horses carry themselves most correctly without a rider on. And that's without any equipment. So this notion that a bit is necessary to create correct carriage and to have horses use their bodies correctly is a really interesting one, because there's not really anything that supports it. There's also this notion that horses salivate more heavily with a bit because of a relaxed jaw. And in certain cases, with like a very mild foam of the mouth, that might be true. But the way we're watching horses froth at the mouth at the top levels of dressage and just spill tons of saliva, so much so that it's dripping down their chest, that's more of an indicator of an inability to swallow. The other thing that I found really interesting with people's reactions to these photos and my discussions of them is a lot of them blamed my hands and said that he was uncomfortable because of my hands. But we see similar expressions and much, much worse in upper level horses. And a lot of the people who were accusing me of causing the problem with his mouth and taking issue with my hands and my use of the bit are the same people who openly defend upper level riders riding around on horses who are actively gaping their mouths with far more prominent stress signals, and even in some cases, blue tongues. So that is also a telling component that a lot of people are more comfortable holding the everyday rider to a higher degree of accountability than they are people at the pinnacle of the sport who should be setting a standard for what best practice is. A lot of people were more comfortable being hypercritical and outright nasty about these old pictures of myself, even as I was taking accountability, assessing my behavior, and talking about stress and the contributing factors. And they were comfortable trying to completely blame me, insisting that it wasn't stress related on the part of the horse, and just saying that it was because I had bad hands. Meanwhile, that same standard of criticism does not get applied to people at the top levels, even when we're seeing the similar degrees of stress, or in some cases, much, much worse. So it's a way of them trying to punish me for talking about my behavior and exposing something that they would rather not be exposed, because they see in his expression probably expressions that their own horse might show, or that they see in their upper level idols, and they don't want to view it as an issue. So then they try to attack me and make me feel shitty about myself when I'm already looking at the problems and addressing them, and try to say that there's no, like, that it's just a skill issue on my part, that I don't ride in a bit now, and that I should have learned how to ride properly in a bit. Meanwhile, like, something that I've found in these shifts that I've made is that when you take away equipment, it actually calls for a higher degree of practice and training, because you can't manhandle control. When my horse was being difficult and I had a bit, I could force him to comply to a certain extent, in a way that I cannot do bridleless or even bitless. If he's being really difficult, he has an easier means of running through the aids bitless or bridleless. So when I'm doing that, I have to have a standard where I have him at a baseline level of relaxation if I actually want to be successful, especially riding off property. And taking him on trail rides and whatnot. And if this riding with less equipment is as easy as a lot of people are trying to make it out to be, where they think that it's a skill issue, where I'm a less skilled rider because of not riding him in a bit anymore, then what we should be seeing is all of these upper level riders and people at the top of the sport who can do the exact same things with their competition horses, but they can't. So it's this interesting thing where I am often met with this mindset that the shifts that I have made are all because I couldn't make it in the traditional horse world, and I couldn't make it as a competitor. But what I have found is there's actually a higher degree or a higher standard that I have to meet now, when my focus on training is consent based and using rewards to compel horses to do what I want them to do, and to make them want to offer those behaviors rather than telling them to do something and making them do it. It was a lot easier to make horses do what I wanted to do by using coercive force, in my opinion. People can disagree with that all they want, but I found it easier to make horses do what I wanted them to do without using consent-based methods. Because if your horse doesn't want to do something, you're actually allowing them to opt out, and you're using rewards as your primary reinforcer, they ultimately have to offer you the behavior before you can reward it. And if they don't want to do it, they just won't do it. So it's a lot harder to get horses to do things that you want them to do if you're training it through the lens of not being able to force them to do it. Anyone can force a horse to do it with enough pressure and enough coercives. Like they are very compliant and placid animals that are notoriously easy to force to do what we want them to do. So this notion that it's inherently less skilled to work with horses through a consent-based framework is not something that I have found to be true. It would be a lot easier for me to have continued doing things the way I used to do if I didn't care about how I was making my horse feel, if I didn't start to see the fractures in my perception of the horse world, and if I didn't start to feel this deep discomfort with how I was showing up for my horse. But then as I started to feel this deep discomfort, I wasn't comfortable continuing to do things the way that I once did because I felt guilty about it. And it wasn't as rewarding anymore. I felt bad about it, and I just didn't feel good anymore. So I had to shift the way that I did things. And yeah, these are just like some examples of photo shoots that I've done with him. This one I chose because in the left photo, he's actively running away from me during a photo shoot. And in the right photo, I have turned him loose on a beach during a photo shoot. In an area with way more open space. And then this is just to exemplify the difference in equipment, how he's carrying himself, and like also the expression. And also what I've noticed is even in myself in these newer photos, I look more relaxed. I look more at ease. I look more at peace. I feel more comfortable. And I think that that's also a huge thing is the mental health component for myself, which is another aspect of when people are trying to shame me for these changes and make me feel bad about it, that I think exposes an inherent flaw in the horse world. If I'm happier doing what I'm doing now, and if I have the beliefs that I do now, and I feel better about myself now, my horses are happier now, and I'm in a better place now than I used to be, that should just be perceived as a win in itself. Anyone who is secure in their own practices and does not feel what they're doing is wrong should not be threatened by me doing me, especially if they just think I'm an idiot who is unskilled and doesn't know anything. The fact that so many people feel the need to go out of their way to degrade other people who are going against the grain, questioning traditional practices, and changing the way they do things, and then being open to talk about that. The fact that so many people feel the need to shut that down and be cruel to people speaks volumes, because a lot of that stems from inner discomfort that they're then projecting on the people who make them feel uncomfortable instead of questioning why they're feeling that uncomfortable. So this is another one, is the difference with the flash and like the whip and the martingale to just riding bridleless. I don't ride with the whip anymore. And I used to be constantly reliant on riding with the whip. Like I used to not be able to really get him to do anything without holding the whip as a threat. This one's a pretty profound one where like, look at the difference in his eye. Even if we're only referencing the eye and we're not looking at the mouth and we're not looking at the chin and the overall face tension, you can see just how much softer his eye is. He looks way more at peace. He looks way more relaxed. And then I chose this photo on the left to juxtapose me looking happy in the same photo versus his face. He does not look happy there at all. And I'm smiling and having a good time, but he's having a terrible time. So it's one of those things where it's also like, what joy is there to be riding a horse if the entire enjoyment is just pushing them to do things that you want them to do and they're having a terrible time the whole time? His face has always looked a lot softer since I've made these shifts. And made changes for the better for his welfare, and he's just responding differently. And now that he's being listened to, he doesn't feel the need to get as big in his behaviors. And again, you see the difference in the eye, the difference in the softness of the nose, less flared nostrils. And he'd been cantering around a beach and doing stuff in this right photo. So it's not like he just wasn't doing anything. He's actively cantering in the right photo. So the narrative that people were trying to paint about my original post about this, about him only looking the way he does because he's not being asked to do as much, just isn't true. And it's them projecting their own personal perspectives onto these photos of me. So me rewarding what I wanted to do and making training less scary, forceful, and stressful has made it easier to get him to willingly comply with me to do things, even when he doesn't actually want to do them. Like he doesn't like the trailer. And loading in the trailer. And like I used to have to load him with a chain over his nose or a lip chain, and he would rear up sometimes at the trailer. One time at Thunderbird, he got loose while I was loading and ran towards the gate by the road of Thunderbird, which is very scary. And I ended up having to leave him there because I could not get him loaded. Nowadays, he just walks right into the trailer because I trained him with positive reinforcement and I made it a less scary and volatile experience. Whereas before, it was a lot of pulling on him and trying to force him in and not allowing him the time to process things and just making it a really scary, forceful, unpleasant experience. This is another one comparing bridleless photos where you can see the top photo. Look at the lips. Look at how his lip is pulled back and how his chin is pulled forward and his upper lip is pulled forward, and then his nostrils are flared and his eye is very tense. And then when we compare that to the bottom photo, we have a much softer eye. He's not gritting his teeth as much and he's much more relaxed. You can also see how much softer my hands are on the neck rope and how much more relaxed my posture is. So my posture has shifted. And then again, we're looking here where he's much more tensed. His eye is intense and kind of glazed over. We've got really flared nostrils. We've got tense chewing muscles. We've got a really tense forward pulled lip. And then he's much more relaxed and soft in the eye with less facial tension in this right photo. And then here again, this is comparing the neck muscles. Look at how overworked these top muscles of his neck are in the top photo. And then we also have a more tense expression, but it's still not as tense as some of the previous photos I've shown. But like, look at the difference in muscular structure here. And this is because of how he was kind of doing a false frame and he would duck behind the vertical and he was holding tension. And then we see a lot more smooth muscle here where it's more consistently level. And also part of this is on the top photos also probably contributed to by the hoof pain, because that definitely influenced how he built muscle when he was holding that much tension. And then these photos, the left ones are once again like the ears and the unhappy mouth, the flared nostrils, the tense eye. And then this bottom photo of me riding bridleless is after he'd been off all winter and I just got on him bridleless in the field. And then the right photo is to show the difference in how he stands. In the top photo, he's still shod with the weights on the fronts and he's mostly been barefoot on the hinds. But look at the difference in his posture. It's profoundly different. He's looking very tense and uncomfortable in the top photo. Even the shape of his neck has changed a lot. How his hind end is built in the top photo has changed a lot. How he stands with the hind legs has changed a lot. There's been a huge shift in his overall posture, and he is looking way more comfortable. And again, this is not just me being like, oh, clicker training did all of this. It's the full change of doing the hoof care and approaching the hoof care, changing the diet. He's now on a forage-based diet and he's eating low sugar. He's now out on more pasture and he's moving around more and he has more space. He's out in a bigger herd. He's not being worked through as much chronic stress. And you can see the difference in his body and how he stands. And the process wasn't linear, because anytime we had any big flare up where he was uncomfortable and he was just struggling a little bit more, we would see some compensatory patterns show up in the body. So it's been a process where I've had to keep making shifts and noticing signs earlier and earlier and pivoting to make changes for the better, especially with his feet, because it's been like hoof issues can be so difficult. So it's not about always having forward progress, because sometimes you do stagnate or even you go backwards a little bit. And then this is a body difference too, where he's still shod on the top feet here. Look at how under muscled his neck and his top line are. He was getting worked harder in the top photo than he is in the bottom photo, but his muscle tone is much more correct and he looks much more comfortable with how he's standing, and his top line is much more full and his neck is much more correct. So we're seeing a horse who is just completely differently, like looks different conformationally because of how much more correct his muscle tone is. And also like the other thing to note with like body work, and when we were working with his shoulders and stuff, when he was shod, his shoulders were always really tight and irritated, and it was hard to get under the scapula to work on the scapula, and he was just so incredibly uncomfortable. So there was so much evidence of these compensatory patterns that we saw in his behavior and also just his overall body image. This is more recent. So the top photo is from last winter, and he gained a ton of weight and he was obese and he had a metabolic flare up where he actually tested having a metabolic issue. And then the bottom photo is after a diet and some changes to hoof care and just some help to get him back down to a normal weight. In the top photo, he's massively obese, and the issues were that like the hay I was getting was probably really high sugar or higher sugar than what what we thought. And then the other issue is that over the winter, he got like some of the horses broke out of their pen and got into like the area that my horses were in, like the horses on the other track, and they must have gotten into the shelter. So there was very little space for everyone to get out. And Milo got kicked really, really hard on his left hind, like right kind of by like his rump. Luckily, because if it hit him in the hock, we probably wouldn't be talking about this today because he would have been severely injured and might not have been okay. But it created a huge hematoma. It was really, really bad. He still has like some changes in the muscle structure from how bad the kick was. And I think that that also influenced how much he moved around. It created more compensatory patterns. And then between that and the metabolic flare up, we had an issue. So he went on a diet. He got glue on shoes put back on. We did the Easy Care Versas on all fours, and they're these composite like polymer plastic type shoe with frog support, and they're really great. So he had several cycles of those to work through the discomfort, and it's made his hooves a lot better. And he only just recently had them pulled his last cycle, and he's been doing pretty well barefoot. And then we're going to see how he continues to do come spring and just really keep an eye on him for the metabolic issues. But his weight has stayed good and he's comfortable and he's got the most sole concavity that he's ever had. So we're on the right track, but we're at the point too where he needs to grow out the hoof issues, like the previously unhealthy hoof patterns, and just continue redeveloping. And then it's also hard because the compensatory patterns in the body from standing a certain way with the metabolic, like not the metabolic issue, with the hematoma, he stood more with like his foot underneath of him, and it caused the heel on that left hind to start to collapse and run forward more. So then that created hoof issues that we're now having to rehab and fix because of how he stood when he was feeling physically uncomfortable. So it was a bit of a setback. These photos are just kind of comparing the changes in us because I was 18 and he was 2 in the left photo, and then he's 13 and I'm 29 in the right photo. And nowadays I get to do things with him that I would have only dreamed of doing in the past. Like there's no way, there's not a hope in hell that I could have ever turned this horse loose on the beach for a photo shoot in the way that I did and actually felt that he would stay with me because he had no incentive to want to stay with me. And he was much more avoidant. So the things that we can do together have really opened up. Like to compare, once again, him running away from me in a photo shoot in the top photo when he was 3 years old, and then this past year at 13, and the middle photo is from a couple years prior, where he's just following me on the beach and staying with me and being an active participant. And this is something that like I never would have been able to do in the past because he would have just left. So it's been a really fully systemic change where I have a much more willing partner who I can do more stuff with. And honestly, like we might be jumping less. There's less showy stuff from the standpoint of maintaining the vision that the industry likes and supports. But I think I can do more with him now. And I think the stuff that he's capable of doing now is honestly more impressive. Like we went on a few bridleless trail rides this past year, which we've done on and off throughout the years. And like I've also ridden him through an old train tunnel bridleless, and we've done all these things that aren't appreciated by the whole of the horse industry in the same way that competition or jumping big fences are. But I think that they're equally, if not more impressive, because having a horse that will willingly walk into a dark tunnel with you without a bridle on, or will climb a mountain for you without a bridle on, or will go across all sorts of different terrain with you without a bridle on and is still responsive and clued in and paying attention. That's something that I think we should be valued a lot more because it's not easy to do. And the level of disdain that a lot of people in the competitive industry look down on with stuff like this, where they just degrade it as just playing with a horse and not really doing anything. It's really biased, but it's also it lacks consistency, because if this is just playing with a horse and it's easy and requires no skill, then all of the people who degrade it and downplay how much work it actually takes to get there should be able to do it with their horses, but they can't because they're reliant on the equipment largely. And you can't just pull it off and do these things with a horse without preparing them. So yeah, like all of these moments where I can allow him more freedom and actually have him choose to stay with me, we're reliant on allowing him the capacity to consent and building a relationship with him where he wants to opt into work and he wants to be involved with me and where he has a good association with work. And it's also made it so that if there are ever situations that are like emergencies where I need to just tell him, hey, like you actually just need to do this thing, he's a lot more likely to say yes because there isn't this forceful history of making him supremely uncomfortable and being incredibly forceful and unfair to him. And I think that this is something that's vastly underrated in the horse world is just like giving horses more choice, noticing their behaviors for what they are, and not just slapping on more training devices, more equipment, or more pressure to get them to comply. Because like forcing horses to do things humans have been historically very good at. Like we've been able to force them to go into war. We've been able to force them to do a lot of things that they otherwise do not want to do. And it's something that we've been good at. But allowing them more choice and having them choose to opt in anyways is something that people are less experienced with, and that is lacking in the horse world. But it is what creates a more willing participant and a horse who is actually a true partner. We love to maintain the narrative that it's a partnership within the horse world and that it's a partnership that's built on the love of the horse. But in practice, that's largely untrue because a true partnership allows communication on either side. What we see normalized in the horse world to a large extent is as soon as the horse starts communicating in a way that the people do not like, then that communication is not acceptable. And that's not a partnership because then we're basically the overbearing voice in the relationship where we get to decide what is and isn't okay for the horse to share, which means we can just steamroll their opinion, bulldoze their perspectives, and completely ignore what they're saying when we don't want to listen. And that's not very fair to the horse, and it also doesn't create an open conversation. What the way we should be looking at horse training is through the lens of all behavior is communication. Everything the horse displays to you is communication, and we should be taking that behavior and listening to it. And sometimes the stuff that horses do, it might just be a actual moment in time where they just had one stressful moment and it's not an indicator of how they chronically are. But a lot of times what people try to frame as moment in times are moments that are repeated time and time again, which as you've seen in these photos that I've shown you is largely true with the images that I've shown of Milo. The those things people who try to claim were just moments in time. And I even had people try to say that to me on my own post, despite me saying, no, these were repeated moments over the course of lengthy periods of time and things that were recurring themes in our relationship in working together. It wasn't a moment in time. It was a pretty good representative of what the reality actually was. And trying to represent it as anything but that is not being honest. And it's interesting to me when people do that with my own photos because at least when I'm talking about upper level professionals, the level of defensiveness could be because it's their favorite rider and they feel like it's unfair that I'm criticizing someone else. But when people do it with myself, it really exposes the notion that a lot of people's motivation to justify these things and write off the significance of what they're seeing in these photos is actually selfishly motivated to make themselves feel better and justify things that they see actively happening in the horse world. Because those moments that I shared were not just moments in time, they were an accurate depiction of what was going on with him. And even when we see stress now, and even when he is having struggles now, they never escalate to the same point. It's never as serious. He doesn't get as worked up. And when he does get a little bit stressed, it's much easier to bring him down. And he's still a very sensitive horse. He's still very in tune with the environment. There's certain things that he really doesn't like. And there's still certain things that he's not super comfortable with. Like an example is in our cross tie area, we have heat lamps. And in theory, the heat lamps should be a nice thing to do, but he doesn't like the sound that they make. So when I turned them on for the first time, he was very, very nervous and he didn't want to stand still. And keep in mind that this is like a 13-year-old horse. So if I wanted to be how I used to be, I could have been like, he's 13. He should know how to tie and stand quietly. I'm going to make him stand and I'm going to get mad at him for being bad. But it was a horse who's reacting to a new sound and a new sensation, and a very sensitive horse who is more overwhelmed by sensory stimuli. So instead of getting mad at him, I got him some high value food and some hay, and I let him just eat in the cross ties. And then I turned them off for a little bit and turned one on at a time, and then gradually let him get used to it. And now he's pretty okay with them. Another thing he doesn't like is he really doesn't like the smell of new leather or new plastic type materials. So you might notice that with my company, I've stopped using him as a model as much. And it's because until the bridle has been worn more by other horses, he's very nervous and apprehensive of wearing it and does not want to put it on. And he is a horse that since I've ever had him, he's been more sensitive to smells, especially like any type of antiseptic band-aid cleaning material where you're trying to clean a wound. He gets really nervous of new scents. And again, it's a situation where I could just be like, you need to just do this and get mad at him. And it's just not worth it because he's really actually a very compliant horse and will let you do what you need to do, even in situations where he's not happy. So it's like in any situation where I don't have to force him to do something and I can make it nicer, why wouldn't I? What reason is there to not give him the benefit of the doubt and just let him take the time that he needs and just be more considerate of his well-being? Because time and time again over the years, even when he was actively stressed, even when his feet were sore and he was uncomfortable, he's largely taken care of me. And he's been a really good partner. He's been a forgiving partner. And he's been a really, really good, solid, smart horse. Like on that trail ride from hell, there was a point at which we were on the side of a mountain ridge, like a cliffside with a big drop bank down into a ravine. And the pathway was only wide enough for a single horse. He was at the back of the pack. And I tied his reins to the horn of his halter so that they didn't hang, and I turned him loose. And that horse followed us like a trained pack horse and was very sure-footed and smart about what he did. He didn't try to bulldoze through any other horses, despite the fact there's no person holding him or controlling what he did. He made intelligent decisions, he made safe decisions, and he came through in a time of emergency, even though he was so overwhelmed, so stressed, and his feet were probably so sore. And there's been times like that, or like similar to that, where there's been situations where things have happened and he's been in a situation where he could have totally freaked out and lost his mind. And he's just been okay. And he's looked at me and he's waited for guidance, even though I've let him down so much in the past. Another example of this is that one time while he was hauling, he got his hay net kind of loosened with how I tied it, and then he'd been pawing because as soon as I parked the trailer before I really started working with him on relaxing the trailer, he would paw and he'd paw quite high. So he ended up getting his foot caught inside the hay net. And he was standing in the trailer with his leg outstretched like this. And my hay nets are always tied to breakaway ties. So if he'd completely freaked out, it would have broken. But he just stood there and he had his leg like this and he just waited. And I went in there underneath the divider of the trailer. I grabbed his leg, I lifted it out of the hay net, and he just stood there and let me do it. And there's been situations like that where he's been in circumstances that would be totally reasonable for a flight animal to completely lose their mind in. And he just consistently comes through and waits for someone to help him. And he's a really solid and good horse. So it's like any situation where I don't have to make things harder for him, or I can just notice how he's feeling and just be a little bit more patient and kind to him is important. And even now, like he's had time off over the winter and throughout, like on and off throughout the hoof rehab that we've done the last year and bringing him back into shape. So as I start to bring him back into work for the spring, summer, I'm going to be doing a lot of groundwork, even though he's broke to ride, he's 13 and he knows what he's doing. It wouldn't be fair to him to just be jumping on him and just riding all the time and doing stuff on his back that I could easily do from the ground and get an even better benefit. And it's just about being more considerate of his perspectives, because he's a sensitive horse. Certain things bother him. He doesn't like certain things. There's certain things that I'll do to be considerate to him that people could just go, oh, that's stupid. He should learn how to deal with it. But then my question is why? Why are horses perpetually being put in these positions where they need to learn how to cope with things that make them very anxious, uncomfortable, or even in some cases cause them pain? But then people never need to give themselves discomfort by changing their perspectives, changing their mindset, changing the pathway to their goals, or changing their goals. How come we never have to be inconvenienced? And why is it always the horse's job to alter their behavior for our benefit? regardless of how it makes them feel. We expect horses to work through discomfort and stress without reacting poorly to it. We expect horses to do what we want all the time, no matter what, and be obedient and never make mistakes, never spook, and all these things where it's like when a horse does something bad, people are like, they need to be put in their place. That's disrespectful. And there's this mindset that they should never do any wrong and then shouldn't behave like an animal. But then at the same time, when people point out the degree of stress that horses are exemplifying, then they bring up the statement and it's like, oh, well, horses aren't robots. And it's like, yes, they aren't robots. So why is there this perspective that they should always be doing what we want them to do, and that anything that they do wrong is disrespectful with the purpose of trying to deliberately upset people and just be bad? There's so many counterintuitive statements that completely contradict with each other within the horse world. And it's really frustrating to watch people contradict themselves at every turn. Like even the whole statement of the horse always comes first, the horse before the sport. But then we see people doing things and justifying things and pushing horses through things for the name of sport, and doing things that are causing them stress or discomfort for the name of sport, and overlooking behaviors that the horse is showing them that are signs of discomfort for the name of sport, and completely just justifying anything that makes them feel remotely uncomfortable, as I saw people do with my own photos of my own horse. And they're flight animals. So something that I've really learned and I've had to sit with for a while is that ultimately, if we're choosing to work with a flight animal who is inherently uncomfortable in new situations, it is more likely to be cautious, it is more likely to be unsure. And if we're choosing to work with an animal that is a herd animal who seeks comfort from the herd setting, we need to take those things into account. There can't be this expectation that just because you want them to, they should be immediately comfortable leaving the herd and just going and doing whatever you want and dealing with scary stimuli without issue simply because you want them to. You need to earn that. You need to build that trust. You need to gradually get them used to doing things. Most of the things we ask horses to do are totally unnatural for them as a species. If we want them to go against their natural tendencies, we need to earn that right, and we need to take on the leadership role that many people like to claim humans have for horses, and actually be a benevolent leader that is considerate of their personal feelings and their emotions. Their emotional state matters just as much, if not more, than their physical state, because the emotional state impacts their physical state. Chronic stress is very expensive on the body, and mammalian species have very similar nervous systems. The research we've done on human nervous systems shows that chronic stress contributes to a lot of physical problems, including like muscular soreness and just bodily issues, but it can also highly contribute to the onset of autoimmune disorders. It also even increases the risk of certain cancers. So if we know that to be true with people, and the research that is growing on that is more and more compelling, we should be applying similar logic to horses and other mammals and assuming that the same could possibly be true about them, because they have a mammalian nervous system. And chronic stress is not healthy. They can't thrive in a stressful environment. On top of this, when horses are chronically stressed, they're not in a state of mind to be actively intaking new information. When they're in fight or flight mode, their mind is focused on trying to do what they need to do to feel safe and to maintain safety. It's not focused on learning new things, especially things that aren't necessarily feeling like they're important to survival. So keeping them in a low degree of stress and keeping them in a calm and relaxed state during training also means they're going to be more likely to retain information. And one of the most telling things about my past with Milo is that I was doing the same things over and over again, and then seeing the consistently same results of him bucking, and being difficult and explosive. And the very things that I like to claim stopped that behavior from happening and helped to work through it, like riding through it and just making him do the thing and not letting him get away with it, they never actually solved the problem. They just prolonged the inevitable, where I would see maybe some improvement for a short period of time, but then we'd rebound back to the same issue. So there is this mindset that these certain things would resolve the issue, but then despite the lack of evidence that that was the case, I still defended it. And I still was of the mind that these things were working, despite the fact that he was really displaying the same behaviors, and in some cases getting worse and worse over the course of years instead of them getting better. Nowadays, despite the fact that people love to claim that positive reinforcement doesn't work, I'm not seeing the same behaviors. I could go get on him right now and go hack him around the property right now, bareback and in a halter, and we would be fine. He would be fine. He's not going to explode and bronc me off. In the past, I always would have to lunge him after time off, even just like a couple of days off. And even then, he would be still explosive. the cold weather would really set him off and he would be really uncomfortable and he would be really difficult. And I can do so much more with him now. Like there was never a time in the past where I could have just done with him the things that I do now because I hadn't built the rapport with him to really make those changes and to create consistent behaviors. And now, even with like less time spent actively training, I'm seeing more behavioral retention because of the state of mind that he's in. He's more comfortable, he's more relaxed, he's a better association with coming out and doing things, and he's being listened to more. The other thing that I think is really key is that horses are trickle feeding herd animals, which means they're meant to be taking in food for the vast majority of their day and just meandering about and slowly taking in food. There's a really anti-food reward narrative in the horse world, and there's a lot of people who love to claim that horses can't focus properly while they're eating, despite the fact that their very being is centered around the perspective of being able to intake food on the go, watch for predators, and be hyper aware of their environment. So by adding food into training, I give him a coping mechanism to help him relax because chewing and salivating helps with relaxation. I create a positive association with training, and I'm making training intrinsically motivating by giving him something that he wants to have and having the primary reinforcer be rewarding the behaviors that I want to see rather than only relieving uncomfortable pressure or punishing what I don't want to see. So it's created a partner who doesn't fear punishment anymore, which means that he doesn't have to worry about the risk of punishment when he's offering new behaviors. He's more likely to offer new behaviors and try to find the correct answers because there's no longer that big risk of being punished. And prior to that, the risk of being punished was such that it's like he doesn't want to try to find the right answer because if he offers the wrong answer, he runs the risk of getting punished. So and then also the other thing too is when they're actively stressed and they're engaging in flight behaviors and then we're punishing them for it, we're punishing a stress response. It's like your friend having a panic attack and then you bullying them and shouting at them or hitting them for being stressed. It's not going to make them not feel stressed. It might make them suppress the symptoms of stress, but it's certainly not going to make them feel more relaxed in that situation. So if we want horses to feel relaxed and safe in training when they're feeling stressed and overwhelmed and scared, we need to be a safe place for them. And you can't be a safe place while simultaneously punishing them for their stress behavior or forcing them to work through it in a way where you're not even looking at it for what it is and you're not even trying to help bring down that stress level and actually results in a reduction of stress. Because if in the beginning of working with Milo, I'd worked on building that foundation and actually reducing stress and making him more comfortable in training, we would have seen more progress in the long term quicker. The thing is that the deterring factor for that was that short term, it would have been a lot more boring. And I didn't know what long term results I would see at the time because it was something that was new to me. So putting in that short term investment of having to slow things right down, ride less, do groundwork, and change the way that I was doing things felt like too much. But in my avoidance of doing so, I created a long term pattern of stress and I created long term physical and emotional issues that have taken even longer to fix than it would have just to initially build the foundation. So that's the thing that's so ironic about the way that a lot of horse people train is in our efforts to try to get to the end result faster, we end up making things take longer and creating lasting issues and in some cases permanently damaging horses and causing problems in the long run because we won't take the time that it takes. Just slowing down and taking the time that it takes and focusing on the foundational structures and building baseline relaxation. In the immediate time, it's going to feel slow and it's going to feel boring and it might even feel like you're not getting much done. But in the long term, you're going to have a much more trainable horse that's going to have a much better perspective about training and be much more relaxed. So the key is openness to continued learning and not getting caught up in confirmation bias and clinging to tradition. I've learned more in the last 3 years than I did in the previous 10, simply because I became more open to being wrong and changing my path and my opinions. Before, when I knew the least, I had the Dunning-Kruger effect where I felt that I knew the most. And I was also really, really standoffish and defensive of any information that questioned what I believed to be true. The research on horse stress and a lot of the comments that people made about Milo's stress immediately felt like a huge threat, because if I admitted that they could be right, it meant admitting the fact that my horse has been chronically stressed. It meant admitting the fact that many of the horses I grew up being around had been chronically stressed. It meant admitting the fact that the way that I grew up being taught to train and handle horses was problematic and wasn't actually creating good partnerships with horses. So it was a really scary thing, because essentially admitting that that stuff might be correct meant completely changing my perspective of the horse world and having that collapse before me and having to completely rewrite my perspectives and belief systems, which was really scary. It's like an ego death. It's like losing a part of yourself, especially when so much of your identity is associated with how you show up for horses. It was really scary to do. And initially it was really difficult. And that's partly why, like, over the years, like, I used to post way more vlogs and training footage and like jumping and whatnot on YouTube and social media. And I started doing less and less of it because it was very discouraging to come to terms with the damage that I'd caused, and to sit with the discomfort of how I'd impacted my horses. And then also to, on both sides, be one, self-critical of the things that I've done, and be so ashamed of them initially that I didn't want to talk about them. And then two, get criticized on either side, because I get criticized by the traditional crowd for making the shifts that I do, or for things not being as interesting, or for training sessions being slower and not being as much flair and interesting for people who are looking for, again, instant gratification and seeing big results in a short span of time, regardless of whether or not it's the best for the horse. So it was discouraging, because a lot of the work for the foundational stuff was boring. And I also was met with a lot of criticism where people were criticizing me for not riding enough. And the reason why I wasn't riding was because my horse was not in the headspace or the physical body space to be riding. And yet people use that as a reason to try to insult my skill and capacity as a trainer because I wasn't riding enough. And that was also something that I found interesting, because what we should really be fostering in the horse world is we should be applauding people for not riding when their horse cannot cope with it or should not be getting ridden. We should be applauding people for taking the slow work and doing the right decision that's less instantly gratifying and oftentimes less fun for the person, for the benefit of the horse. And yet I was criticized for doing more groundwork and taking a step back from riding. And even now, people criticize me for not riding as much, despite the fact that I'm still getting stuff done with training. And like, honestly, for me, like, I fail to see the logic behind trying to insinuate that doing the stuff I do now is inherently less impressive. Like, why was it more impressive for me to be jumping around with a course with my horse who was bronching the whole time, basically, than it, or riding through all those bucks, than it is for me to take him off property and trail ride bridleless? I don't see why. And then also when I'm feeding him on the trails, I get criticized for feeding him. They're like, let's see you do without the treats. And it's just such a funny thing, because it's like, if I were to, and I sometimes I do this, but if you respond to comments like that and you're like, let's see you do without your bit or your bridle, they get pissed and they'll be like, oh, my horse will die and crash through fences and severely injure themselves. And it's like, okay, well, why are you fixating on what my reinforcer is and telling me to go without it when you objectively cannot do the same thing as me? And it's such an interesting perspective. And I think it also prevents a lot of people from making these changes because they are ridiculed for it. You're made fun of for using food. People try to frame it as being inherently less skillful. And they try to say that you're bribing the horse, except bribes precede the behavior, not follow it. And when you're rewarding a horse, they've already done what you're asking them to do. And why is there such a negative connotation to the idea of rewarding the horse with something they want to tell them they've done a good job? But there's not this problem with using highly coercive equipment or high pressure force to get the horse to comply. Why is that causing less discomfort than the idea of using food rewards? And that's something that we need to unpack as a community, because there's this huge disdain towards rewards-based training and this huge hate on for it, and people who are so threatened by it that they go out of their way just to troll and trash talk rewards-based trainers, and be unkind about it. And sure, you could argue that people are uncomfortable with the criticism towards traditional training practices, which is fair. However, there is scientific merit to being critical of things that we are seeing going on in the horse world. And if the goal is to change and grow and better our perspectives, and if we're all truly open to doing these things, then there should be that openness to considering new information that conflicts with our belief systems. So with me, my perspective has shifted to where I initially basically only trained with negative reinforcement for many, many years, and I would use punishment regularly. And now I try to basically make things as rewarding as possible, and rewards are my primary training method. And it does make it for slower going, especially when you're working on a behavior that the horse is uncomfortable with, afraid of, or something that they don't want to do, because you need to get them comfortable. You need to get them to want to do the thing. And that can take more time than just trying to use brute force to force them. However, it solves problems in the sense that if you ever encounter a horse that brute force doesn't work on, or eventually if you're using force all the time, there's going to come a time where the horse is so afraid of something that they're more afraid of it than they are of you and the consequence, and then they say a hard no. And then what? Because you'll struggle to help them relax, and you'll struggle to help them feel safe, because you have been a source of stress for them so repeatedly that they don't feel comfortable around you. Yet, with rewards based training, you're creating a pattern of behavior of good feelings and making them feel comfortable doing the things that you're asking. And the goal is to create a calm, well adjusted horse that is a willing participant in training. And that should be a goal. So for me, a question, like when I started studying horse behavior and also human psychology, and I learned more about operant conditioning, and I learned more about the function of negative reinforcement and how it functions by removing an uncomfortable or aversive pressure, the question that I asked myself is that I was like, if the only thing I'm reinforcing my horse with is the relief of an uncomfortable pressure, what incentive is there for to like the work that I'm asking them to do? And I couldn't answer that question, and I still can't. And it made it so that I really had to reflect on that and start to make changes. And initially, I was pretty resentful of it because I had such a limited training toolbox that I didn't know where to go. And I felt really frustrated. And it kind of took a lot of the eagerness towards training that I felt, because I just felt very discouraged. I felt very guilty. And I just felt very overwhelmed by the idea of, Lint, don't walk on the keyboard, by the idea of changing my method so completely and not having Lint, he's on my keyboard, not having an exact direction to go. And it was so overwhelming that initially I resisted it, but then deep down I still felt such immense discomfort with like the feelings that I was feeling, that ignoring it and trying to make justifications didn't go away. It just made me very frustrated. And also like angry and highly defensive. So it was a really difficult transition, and it's also involved a lot of inner work. So all the stuff I've mentioned about the horse is just one component, because a huge other component was getting out of toxic relationships, going to therapy, reflecting on my own lack of self-esteem and insecurities, reflecting on how closely linked my identity was to horses, because criticism of my training and the things that I believed about horses felt like criticism of myself, even though that wasn't the case. And it's taken a lot of time to completely reflect on that and to really make these adjustments and changes. So it's been a process, and it's been a lot of inner work. And even now, it's like my perspectives are still going to continue to change. Like another 3 years from now, I could be grabbing photos from like this time and talking about issues that I see in them and further changes that I've made. But we need to normalize that perspective, because that's how we continue growing. That's how we make a difference. And the idea that it's shameful to admit that you're wrong, or that there's something inherently bad about admitting your wrongs, and that you should that it means you're less intelligent or less knowledgeable, it's so far from the case. The people who are the most comfortable admitting that they were wrong are the people who tend to learn the most, because they're open to the idea of pivoting their perspectives with new information. And it's an important thing to do. Like I consistently trust role models more that can talk about when they're wrong and talk about mistakes they've made and use it as a learning experience, than people who are perpetually right and refuse to consider that belief systems they've held could possibly be wrong. And it's just such an important aspect of personal growth, is to be considerate of that and to make those changes. But as it stands now, there's a lot of empirical evidence that calls to question normals in the horse world. There's a lot of research that's coming out now on steel horseshoes and horseshoes without frog support that questions the impact they have on the body of the horse. And despite this information, a lot of people's first response is to push back against it immediately and get highly defensive and refuse to even entertain the possibility that there might be better alternatives out there. And the thing alone that really sold me on it when I started to seriously think about it is if you look at the traditional steel horseshoe, like just what you think of when you hear the word horseshoe, that structure of a horseshoe has been around for centuries. So the lack of change over the course of centuries, despite how much we've learned about horses, should be an inherent red flag, because it's not that it's such a perfect design that there's no consideration of the damage it caused. There's lots of reason for concern, and there's studies on it too, and there's lots of examples within the horse world that are cause for concern. Yet despite that, a lot of people cling to the tradition and are just set on this idea, and also set on the ideas like some horses need shoes, or some horses need bits. Oh, also to the person asking about a Facebook group or chat for support group for growth and positive journeys with our horses, I have one on Facebook called Milestone Equestrian Support Group. If you look it up, or if you go on like my Facebook page, it should be linked, and that's exactly what it's for. And it's been really great because a lot of people post their journeys in there and they get support and they get like-minded people. And there's also people who can comment and support and give advice as well, because there's some trainers in there as well. But yeah, like it not being able to acknowledge when you're wrong and make changes is a huge problem. And like the lack of openness to scientific information and how much horse people cling to tradition despite the lack of evidence is really concerning. Just the more I've learned about hooves in particular, like I'm very convinced that a lot of the physical issues we see in horses are deeply connected to hoof health, because if you look at the average upper level horse's hooves, they're not the indicator of the best care. A lot of them show high signs of dysfunction, and they're performing at a very high athletic level while functioning on those hooves. The other thing is the notion that some horses just need shoes or bits. There might be some small cases where there are horses who need them, but in reality, I think most of the time it's an excuse made by the human to avoid exploring other options. A lot of times if a horse is dead lame without shoes, it's because of an underlying pathology, or it with bits and whatnot, it's because people lack the capacity to train the horse to be soft enough to be responsive to other types of equipment. I have yet to find a horse that I haven't been able to train to go bridleless. Ultimately, you're limited by your perspectives of what is possible. So if you have this perspective that your horse is just unique and can never be trained to go with less equipment, you're going to struggle to be able to make that happen because you don't even believe it's possible. And therefore, you're not going to be able to look at the paths that you can take to make that happen. And so it's a self-limiting perspective. And a lot of horse people have that because they don't even want to believe these things are possible. They want to create the narrative that the people who do these things simply have an easier horse who's calmer and more adaptable. And I've had people try to apply that to Milo, which from the videos and stuff that we looked at is absolutely not the case. And I have like a decade worth of videos of him freaking out and doing stuff like that on my YouTube channel for anyone who wants to further reaffirm that. And I also probably have old videos where I'm talking about bullshit that I'm now calling bullshit, but fully believing it. And it's not the case. Like, he doesn't go bridleless because he's an easy horse. He can do it because I put the work in to train him to do that. So anyways, that's the last of the slideshow. I still have some more stuff to say, so we're not done now, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to comment now. If you've enjoyed watching this so far, if you would please subscribe to the channel, like and share. It really helps boost the channel. I've been getting shadow banned lately, so any of that type of support really helps. And then if you're also interested in helping support me as a creator, I have links in the description of this podcast. And any and all support allows me to continue offering free /sliding scale webinars like this, because I wanted to make this free to access for people who couldn't afford to pay. But I did put like 8 hours of work into doing this, including like the prep time and then the time that I've done now. So it is time consuming, and it's not something I can physically do all the time without charging, but I want to make stuff as accessible as possible. So I'm hoping that these sliding scale things and doing it by a donation basis would be feasible, because then I can continue to offer free webinars for people who can't afford them, or for people who are kind of fence sitting and don't want to pay for something that they don't believe in yet, to help change more minds. But it's not super feasible to do all the time otherwise. Yeah, so anyways, if you are interested in doing that, that's fantastic. And it would be immensely appreciated. The other thing is, yeah, any questions? For the person asking, what do you think about martingales in general? I just like that my barn makes me use them. Like, running martingales are like the most benign of all martingales. I think the issue that I have with them is the fact that they're like a band-aid fix, where it's like your horse is raising their head, so you're putting on a martingale. And like, I largely use the excuse of like, oh, safety wise, like your horse could throw their head and hit you in the face. And like, I kind of get that, but it's also like, why is your horse throwing your head so much? Why is your horse being so high-headed that you feel the need? So they're a band-aid fix in the sense that they're serving to solve the symptom of another problem. So in my perspective, the solution should be solving the problem and trying to just like address why your horse is going high-headed, because often high-headedness is due to anxiety. It's due to them feeling physically uncomfortable. It can be due to saddle fit. And especially when we're referencing stuff like jumping, if a horse is head tossing and throwing their head all the time, and doing stuff like that, like that's something that should be looked at, and it can be fixed through groundwork, and it can be fixed through like addressing the underlying causes and building a better foundation. And I think that that's a key component that I think people should be more considerate of, is just addressing why the behavior exists in the first place, instead of looking for symptoms to suppress it, because it just creates this mindset of like the focus is just getting rid of the behavior and suppressing it from existence, rather than looking at why it exists in the first place and being conscious of that, and making changes to avoid it. Because a lot of times when horses are head tossing, they're better off doing groundwork, flat work, foundational stuff to build strength and make it more possible for them to carry themselves correctly with the saddle, and just taking the time to reduce the reasons that cause them to respond that way, rather than just using a piece of equipment to try to suppress the behavior. So like, regardless of whether or not someone uses a martingale, the goal should be to like actually address the underlying causes, instead of just slapping it on, jumping around anyways, and doing stuff like that. And I want to tilt my camera so you guys can see Lint in my lap. See, look at him. He's so cute. He's the cutest little guy. We're struggling. So yeah, so that's where I think that aspect is really important. Can we tilt it? This is going to be Lyn's podcast now. Sponsored by coconut water. Yeah, you guys can look at Lynn for a little bit because he's being really cute. But the biggest thing should be actually trying to address the causes of behavior. So what are your thoughts on using taste bits, like bits that taste nice? I used to ride a horse with a bit years ago. It was almost bitten through at some point. Horse was crazy about it. I think like it can be a good way to get a horse to be more accepting of a bit. That said, like I think the primary focus for bits should be choosing a mouthpiece that is as anatomically and physically comfortable as possible, and doesn't cause them pain, and isn't operating by using like pain compliance, because that way you can help ensure that your horse is going to be physically comfortable. Like basically any type of equipment that is being, sorry, Lance, I know. Like, why do you keep basically any type of equipment that is used to create discomfort to form a response from the horse is going to create a negative association with work, and it's reliant on creating a response by increasing the threat of consequence on the part of the human. For me, like a lot of people on my channel, like when I post stuff now, they love to say that I'm anti-bit, and that's really not the case. However, what I am is I'm very considerate of how much more invasive to the horse and the body the bit is, and also the fact that the bars of the mouth are pretty sharp. Like they're sharp little bones that are underneath gums, so it doesn't take that much to cause discomfort. And also the studies on bits are pretty compelling from the standpoint of just showing that there is a higher prevalence of oral damage than what a lot of people want to admit, and that there is a higher prevalence of stress in horses when ridden in bits than a lot of people want to admit. And that is something that I think we need to look a lot deeper into with much more openness and consideration of the fact that perhaps there is a bigger argument for the ethics of bits, especially how many different types of bits are on the market. And I think that there should at least be willingness to make changes and be just more comfortable with the idea of like letting go of outdated traditions if there's reason for that to be the case. And what I see in the horse world is a lot of people who don't even want to consider the fact that there might be need to reflect on how bits are used and what types of bits we allow. There's a lot of pushback and immediate refusal, which stands to exemplify what I was saying about people seeking confirmation bias and having no willingness to consider an alternative perspective, because basically they're just immediately justifying an issue without wanting to look further into it. And ultimately, we just need more research to actually like show the ethics behind horse sports and argue why they are ethical and why the equipment we use is okay, and at least like show our work. So the next question is it bad to ride a horse before they're skeletal? I know a lot of people say skeletally, but skeletal is actually also correct. I've had people correct me on it, and it bothers me because both are correct. But many get pissed and disagree, but I've also heard it causes irreversible damage. Thanks so much for advocating. After following Beck's Nairn's work and then also working with racehorses as much as I have, I just don't see an argument for why people need to be riding around on 2 and 3 year olds for any reason that's not just about the people and like what humans want to do. So I think that it's like you can do a lot of groundwork to prep a horse for riding at those ages that will prepare them better and results in better long-term health. And you can also do the benefits that are like bone remodeling and helping the horse build strength for riding and use their body in a way that's going to be beneficial without actually sitting on their back. Like all of the studies people cite to justify riding horses young are about bone remodeling, and they fail to recognize the fact that you can create the same number or the same amount of bone remodeling simply by allowing horses lots of turnout, especially on varied terrain, and that you can do it through groundwork as well. So it's an inherently flawed argument because it's operating on the mindset that the only way to create those benefits is by physically sitting on their back. And the spine's the least developed part of their body. So when you have an underdeveloped spine, and then you also have a horse who's not even fully mature in a lot of other areas of their body, it just doesn't make sense to put weight on the spine and be asking them to do things. And then also when you couple that with how quickly a lot of people start their horses, it doesn't even allow them the time to build the soft tissue structures to function and carry a rider properly. So then you have an immature skeleton. You have a horse who's not fit enough to pack the amount of weight they're being asked to do at the level of work they're being allowed to do. And it creates a lot of problems. And there needs to be way more research. I think the problem is that the funding for said research, a lot of the places that have the most money to fund it aren't going to want to fund the research, or if they have funded it and the research is there, they're not going to publish it, because I really truly believe the findings of that research would be incredibly damning to the sport, and it would make it very, very hard for people to argue the ethics of starting horses as young as they do and doing the things that we do to them for sport, especially for racing and whatnot, because it's just not true that the younger a horse has started racing, that the sounder they are long term. They might have longer racing careers, but like their bodies are pretty messed up after. And I've been present for so many vet checks for racehorses that like I'm very, very confident in saying the damage that it causes, because I have not seen the level of problematic findings that I've seen with off the track thoroughbreds replicated in any other type of horse. And with that said, there is like the bias of I've seen more vet checks with racehorses than I have with other types of horses. But even if we were to take like a pool of 5 racehorses versus 5 other types of breeds and like balance out that, the problems in racehorses are still much more prevalent. So I think that like the bone remodeling thing, the focus for studies like that should be like, this is why you should turn out your horses all the time, but especially when they're young, because there's like studies that show younger horses that are turned out have better bone. And then there's also studies that show even with older horses, when they get more turnout and they're not stalled as much, they are sounder and they're less likely to have soft tissue injuries than horses that aren't getting turnout. So we have information that shows like a pretty clear picture, and then we also have the anecdotal components of all of that. But there's a lot of pushback to accepting that information because it feels threatening to people. And then there also is just a lack of willingness to want to fund that research. But we have people who are just kind of doing it on their own dime or by donation, like Bex Nairn, and there's another account on Facebook called The Study of the Equine Hoof, and they dissect a lot of horses. And there's very consistent findings in certain types of horses that are really concerning. There's one particular video with Bex Nairn that's worth looking at where she shows how flimsy the pelvis of like a 2-year-old horse is. And it's the bone is so thin that you can basically just like break it really easily with very little pressure. So then when you factor in the idea that a lot of people are adding the weight of a full person and then doing things like sliding stops or like running a horse on a track, it's really concerning. So there's just a lot of reasons to reflect on those things. And like between that and also just the studies that we do have on bits, comparing bits to bitless, like there's enough of consistent trends that like while I don't necessarily think people should just go bits are always evil, they're always terrible, there's enough research showing concerning trends that it's like there's literally no reason people should write it off and just immediately go, it's just the hands behind the bit, because we don't know enough to say that yet, and we're seeing very concerning trends. And also the stress trends on horses under saddle and stuff. We're seeing concerning enough trends that there needs to be a further look into this, and we need to stop being so like against reflecting and considering that the way we're doing things now isn't sustainable or fair to the horses. Because I do think that the more money that gets put into this type of research, it is going to be really damning. But I think that what we're going to notice is the more research that comes out, the people who don't want to change, the more they're going to double down, the more threatened they're going to feel, and the more defensive they're going to be. Because ultimately, for certain types of people, it doesn't matter how much research there is if the research isn't pointing in the directions that they want, because they're seeking confirmation bias. So what you will see is people looking for studies that support their perspectives that they want to believe, or even just looking for anecdotal belief systems from people who sound somewhat credible to support the perspectives that they want to believe, and not looking at them through a critical lens. Because even the bone remodeling studies that a lot of people cite, they're not actually supporting the idea that for longevity into retirement and for the full length of what you'd want a riding horse's career to be, that it's actually the most beneficial to do that. And also anyone who's being honest that is actually well immersed in the industry can speak for how common it is for horses to get joint injections and to get treatments that are at a pretty young age that are the direct result of the damage on joints. And then regarding the question with the skull, if it has damage on it, yes, it does. It has some bone remodeling right along the bars, and then there's some bone remodeling like right behind the canine tooth, which I don't know if that could for sure be from a bit, unless someone was just riding with a bit way too low, or if they were like dropping it and hitting it on the tooth. It could be from like trauma to the tooth itself, but there's definitely bone remodeling along the bars of the mouth. And it's something that in like dissections and a lot of other things that people notice too. And even in studies on living horses, we see a lot of studies that are showing that oral lesions and damage to the mouth are way more common than they should be, with some studies finding up to 80% of horses with lesions in the mouth, and then other studies finding like 40 to 60%. And like even if it's only 40% as the average, is that not concerning that 40% of horses are having oral damage from bits? Because that's a very good sign that it's not sustainable. That should not be happening. If bits are only rough, as harsh as the rider's hands, then it means that 40% or more, 40 to 80% of riders have really harsh hands and cannot use a bit without causing oral lesions. Or we're in denial of how bad it is. Yeah, I can try to see if they'll show up on camera for the skull. 1 second. Okay. I'm gonna have to turn off the background. So this is Doornail, the horse skull. Let's see. Oh shoot, I just took his front skull off. This is gonna be awkward. But like right in here, the bar, there's remodeling right. Oh, it's not. I'm gonna turn off the background. Blur. So like right in here, there's like big bone remodeling on the side of this canine. If you compare it to this canine, see how there's like no bump there. So this has huge remodeling, and the tooth here has actually grown in crooked. So what I think might have happened is there's trauma to the tooth. But then there's a bump here, which it's really hard to get the depth with this. There's a bump right here, and then the bars are just really rigid, and there's like some more bone put down right where the bit would sit. There's no damage to the teeth from what I can see. I also like I really wish that I could get a skull where I know the history of the horse that the skull came from. Um, but yeah, I wish I knew the history of that horse and what that horse was used for and like what discipline they did and the age of death. But to get a skull like that, I'd basically have to clean it myself and like ask someone to cut the head off of the body, which I don't think I'm ready to do yet. However, if someone would do that for me and clean the skull for me, I would pay them for it. But basically, yeah, like what we're finding is that a lot of the studies that we have on horses, they're calling into question normalized practices. And I think it's very scary to people who've just like lived their life believing what they're doing is right and aren't ready to reflect on it. And I think there's also a huge amount of fear, which I know for myself initially. Um, there was this mindset where I didn't want to accept that things could be wrong because it meant having to completely pivot and change everything as I know it and change my goals. And I didn't see what the alternative to that would be. Like I didn't see what my life would look like after. I didn't know how I would feel about it. Um, so the idea of having that amount of change happen and have my life be disrupted in that way was really quite scary. And I really like I avoided it for a while. He's back and he's gone again. Dude, you cannot walk across the keyboard. I'm sorry. I know your life is a prison. You guys are just watching me use coercive force on a cat by picking him up so he can't walk across my keyboard, even though he wants to. But yeah, I think there's a lot of unwillingness to change because people don't want to have to rewrite their perspectives or change their path to their goals. And for me, that was a huge thing because initially I thought my biggest goal was wanting to compete and move up the levels of show jumping. And anything that felt like it threatened that, I was like really opposed to, where I was like, oh, if I have to change this and like I accept this and I have to consider my horse more, that's going to alter how I can get to my primary goals. So it was like it's like obviously a very selfish decision. Um, and it like, again, it's stemming from a place of fear. And I think that's what we're seeing with a lot of people where they are responding to fear. Oh, thank you for noticing the shirt. Yeah, this design, I don't know if they still sell them, but it's from the charity Penny Appeal, and it's literally my favorite thing. It's like all embroidered, and it's so nice, and it's very comfy. But I actually got it. Someone brought up Gabor Mate recent, like further up in the chat. I got it at a fundraiser that he was speaking at that was hosted by Penny Appeal. And he's such a cool person. So like a lot of my perspectives on trauma and like neurodivergence and stuff, and just like the shifts in like how I perceive society as a whole and like see the brokenness within it. A lot of that has kind of been informed by his work because he's got a lot of interesting thoughts on trauma and how it influences physical and mental health. And it's definitely a really good read because it's stuff that I've also thought about and applied to horses, like I mentioned earlier, with like the prevalence of like autoimmune disorders because of stress. And yeah, so it's really it was really cool. But I think that yeah, the horse world is pushing back against change because a lot of people don't want to see the way that they show up in the horse world change. And I think even it gets down to the point where when we see people really pushing against the idea of basics, like how important turnout is, and stuff that like is so well researched at this point that there's not really any argument against it, they don't want to change even their like regular community because changing barns to look for a more suitable one might mean driving further. It might mean leaving your barn family and community. It might mean no longer having an indoor arena and like choosing to let go of human comforts for the benefit of the horse. And a lot of people don't want to do that either. So they push back against it and they make excuses and they get mad at people who trigger discomfort or guilt in them, instead of looking at themselves and recognizing the fact that if you truly feel like nothing you're doing is wrong and you feel good about the decisions you're making, what some random person says on the internet, um, as like a general statement, like they're not even personally attacking you, it shouldn't matter. It doesn't reflect on you if you feel good about what you're doing, and you should be able to move on. And if you're not able to, it's a sign that you are experiencing insecurity about the things that you're doing. Um, and like I speak again from experience, because I was very insecure about these things initially, and I would respond highly defensively because it made me feel insecure. And rather than sitting with that insecurity and being like, where is this coming from? Why do I feel this way? Why is this random stranger making me feel like I have to like defend myself and prove myself to them? I just like tried to basically argue with them to make my point and try to get them to agree with me, because then that would validate the perspective that I held. And we see that happening a lot in the comment sections, especially on a lot of my posts. Um, and and yeah, it's crappy recognizing that you've harmed your horses a lot, like especially like Milo's feet. Like it's such a consistent issue that's taken such a long time to address that like I do have to sit with the fact that like if I had done things differently and if I'd made different decisions, oh my God, Lynn, you're climbing me. If I'd made different decisions, that we would be further along in a lot of ways. And it's hard because it's frustrating, as I look back now and I'm kicking myself and I'm going, wow, if I had just seen things differently back then, and if I had just done this back then, like things would be very different right now. And but it's also like part of the process, and it's like it's better late to address certain issues than to never do it and to just commit to being wrong and commit to buying into belief systems that are harmful to your horse. You're better off like making those changes sooner than later, and it's really never too late to have a pivot in mindset, like because otherwise you're just committing to being uncomfortable for the rest of your life and having your lack of willingness to change be a dagger in your side every time someone posts something that exposes how little you've grown. And I've noticed this too, is some of the people who are the meanest to me online, the most condescending, the nastiest, the most likely to personally attack, a lot of them are people who are quite a bit older than me. And I think that level of animosity stems from the fact that one, they're pissed off that someone younger than them is saying things that make them feel uncomfortable. And they try to use their age as like a badge of honor and expertise, when it doesn't matter how long you've been doing something if you've been doing it wrong and making the same mistakes repeatedly. Um, and then they also are violently uncomfortable about things that they have never questioned for years being questioned by someone. And the discomfort that's associated with that, their goal is to try to neutralize the threat, which is me and what I'm saying, instead of dealing with what it's bringing out in them. And especially like men that are quite a bit older than me, that's where I get the most volatile response, and usually an incredibly condescending one where they'll call me like sweetie or like pet names, and basically just be like, oh, you'll learn more when you grow up. And it's just like being really shitty. And like I hate that. Like, and I've made comments about this where I criticize old people who have those mindsets. And then I get people who are really defensive and they're like, you're criticizing all old people. And it's like, no, I'm criticizing people who are older and haven't grown and changed and who use their age to try to condescend anyone who is younger than them, having an opinion that differs in them, and acting like any disagreement with their perspective is just age related naivety. And it's ridiculous. Like I can't stand it, because it's like regardless of how old you are, you can learn stuff from people who are younger than you. There's a lot of people who are just starting out riding that have really insightful perspectives about horses and notice things and are really in tune with things that a lot of horse people overlook and miss. And the fact that they're less experienced with horses doesn't discredit a lot of their perspectives. So there's something to learn from everyone. And as soon as people operate with this mindset of like, oh, I've done this for X number of years, so therefore I'm automatically right, it's a huge red flag that they've done things wrong for a very long time and that they're not willing to reflect and change, because their sole badge of honor for their expertise is how long they've been alive. How long they've been alive and like how long they've been in an industry, as if that alone is enough. Doing something wrong for a very long time does not mean that it's not wrong. And believing something for a very long time does not mean that it's correct. Like we see it consistently trending in different aspects of society where people are like, oh, this is the way things have always been. And then they try to shut down any criticism of the status quo because this is the way things have always been. It's like, okay, the things being this way for a long time does not mean they need to stay that way. It does not mean that we're doomed to continue doing this again and again and again. We can and should change and improve society, and the fact that it feels helpless to do that or that it feels difficult to do that is not a reason that we shouldn't be pointing out the issues. And I see it with a lot of systemic societal issues too for humans, where humans are actively suffering, where people are like, oh well, that's the thing way things are, like talking about it's going to change any of it. And it's these people who are basically trying to make you feel bad about talking about issues and being like, oh, that's not going to do anything, it's never going to change, blah 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 blah. And it's like, the only thing that guarantees nothing's going to change is doing nothing. Talking about things and bringing problems out into the world and creating community and validating people who've also felt off about things that they're going. It might not create immediate change, but it doesn't mean that it's not chipping away at the change that is to come. It's as silly as people like walking into a canyon and going, oh, like the water never could have done that. Like it's too slow. It's not gonna. It's never gonna change. It's always been a mountain here. Or it's always been blah blah blah. It's like no. We watch things change in the world over the course of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years of slow movement. Society doesn't need to move that slow, but it doesn't mean that there's no efforts that slow little changes aren't going to inspire change. And we're already seeing it happen in the horse industry. And I do think that the level of anger, resentment, and defensiveness is only going to get worse the more pressure that is put on people to change and the more people who start to reflect on certain perspectives and see what's really going on in the world. Because the fact of the matter is, if mistreatment of horses was not normalized to a massive extent, we would not be seeing the amount of abuse scandals that we are seeing in Olympic level riders. We wouldn't be seeing so many high profile riders caught doing really crappy things and really problematic things repeatedly throughout the years. And those are just what's caught on video. That's not even including witness accounts and people who have been immersed in that type of world and then come out of it and have seen things. But there's so many instances of abuse, both to horses and humans, across the horse world that show that this is a pattern of behavior. And it doesn't matter that not everyone is guilty. We shouldn't be waiting until everyone is guilty of participating in abuse to care about it. The fact that it happens to the extent that it does is enough, and that's enough of a reason to shift and change. Really, like that's all it is that we just need to keep looking at things and being willing to change. Like I've had people ask me like, oh, well, what if research came out that showed that like there's no way to do riding ethically? Would you stop riding? Yes, I would. However, I think that a lot of the research that we do have on riding horses is skewed by how the riding is done, when the horses are started, how coercive the training is, and how far they're pushed along. So that in itself, like if the more we study it, it's going to honestly make riding look very bad. But I see the anecdotal evidence of people who do start things the slow way and see less problems and see sounder horses and more comfortable willing horses. And when we're not fighting horses with threats and stress all the time, naturally they're probably going to be sounder. Like even the sheer physical component of being really tense and just like all locked up all the time, it's really hard on your body. Like when I'm stressed, my body's physically sore after from just holding so much tension throughout the day. And naturally, that's going to end up creating negative impacts to the horse. So that's a factor that could result in a lot of change. And then when we also factor in the changes related to boarding, management, and providing more species appropriate care, there's so many different moving parts that contribute to how damaging certain practices are to horses, and just slowly shifting some of them, even if it's just one at a time and even if it's just little pieces at a time, it's going to make a difference for the horses. It's going to make them better. And it's not about changing it all at once, because it can be overwhelming to change it once, but it's like pick something and start to make little improvements. All of these people who don't think that turnout is important, if they introduce their horse in a safe way to a herd turnout situation and witness the behavioral difference, they would be eating their words so quickly. They would be seeing an instant change in how their horse responds to the environment around them, and it would very quickly change their perspective if they had to witness that. I also think that if more people were involved in their horses' day-to-day lives more, like actually seeing how their horse lives, how they exist in a stall, what their day-to-day looks like, if they were involved in the regular care and had to sit with the reality of their horse's situation and what their horse looks like at different times of the day, there would be a lot of people who would be more uncomfortable with what they're witnessing. Do we have any comparisons of horses' spines before domestication and now? I'm curious of the changes, both selective breeding wise and damage wise. I'm not sure, but probably, because there have been studies that have compared horse skeletons from quite a long time ago to now. However, those ones were definitely when the horses were being ridden, because it was looking at bit damage even in horses from a long time ago. So it's been a consistent issue there. But I do know that there is increasing discussions about like how selective breeding, especially with dressage horses, has created hypermobility, and then it's created spinal issues and neurological issues as a result. And we're seeing more and more signs of that, which is really concerning. So I think more stuff like that is going to come out. And I think that's the big thing, is just like looking at things with nuance, critically thinking, being open to pivot and change, and also considering the perspective that it's like the black and white perspective, where it's like you either have to support all use of bits always and never criticize them, or if you criticize them, it means you're completely anti-bit, or if you criticize competition, it means you hate everyone in competition and think they're all abusive. Things aren't that black and white. There's nuance to everything. Even the extremist views we see from people who are really entrenched in like extremist animal welfare views, where they view any use of horses at all as abuse, that largely stems from seeing so much misuse of horses that they cannot conceptualize a kinder way of doing things, and therefore they're not open to the idea of it. If we started to make changes in practice, sorry, Lint is sitting on the banister, or like the curtain rod. Okay, wait, I'm gonna, this won't zoom in, but I'm gonna try to show you guys. Can you see him? It's dark. Put him up there. What you doing? But yeah, so the more changes we can make and the more open we become to changing things and the more nuanced people look at things with, the more positive changes can be able to come. Like, we just need to have an approach that's not viewing everything as an attack. Like, we should be criticizing and reflecting on practices and making decisions. And like, doing so doesn't mean that you think that the whole sport needs to be completely thrown out or that all riders are abusive. It just means that we're critically looking at stuff. And I do think that the way the horse world has been constructed and the level of coercion and force that's even been applied to people as they start riding, it's created this narrative that to criticize is to completely attack and not see anything with any nuance, and to tar someone as an abuser, when it's like, no, you can criticize actions and recognize the fact that people are subject to change. They're not doomed to make the same mistakes forever, and you can absolutely improve and do better. There's a lot more options than this really black and white perspective. The fact that I've made the changes that I have means that like anyone can, and I'm open to the idea. Like, there's no point in even hosting webinars like this if there isn't this belief that people can change. Because otherwise it's like, who am I talking to? And like, that's the nature of advocacy, is believing in the possibility of change. I also do think that with the horse world and like with how we use horses, it's very capitalistically motivated, and there's a big element of like patriarchy within the training of horses and the use of horses, and especially in competition. The capitalistic aspect of it is what makes the training of horses faster and pushes horses faster and keeps upping the bar for how showy and impressive sports need to be and how difficult they need to be. And the status aspect of like moving up the levels as a rider, all of these things feed into one another to create a bigger issue. So like, the horse industry really is just a mirror of other issues we're seeing in society. Because like, if we look at the history of horses, we've used them to conquer land and to colonize and to commit war acts, and they've been really central to the development of the world as we see today. So it's all connected, and by starting to address and develop elements and other perspectives of the world and also see how it contributes to how we look at horses, it's important. Like, I always have people being like, stop being political. Horses aren't political. Everything's political. If you don't think that how society functions and what you've normalized in your day-to-day life impacts how you show up for everything in your day-to-day life and how you approach other things, you are not being honest with yourself. It is all connected. What we normalize every day and how we make people live and what we just accept in life it impacts how we see everything. The other thing too is like when you start to make shifts and you just get you go into the unknown, you realize that you can do it, and it creates resilience, and it makes it easier to commit to doing the foundational work and doing things without being able to see the end result, and recognize that it's the right thing to do. But yeah, like getting on, like that's a book recommendation. But yeah, getting uncomfortable with uncertainty is important, because also some people will choose to just weather an uncomfortable reality that's not even serving and meeting their needs, and they don't even want to consider the fact that it could be changed for the better. And I think part of it stems from the fear that if we're not successful in making it happen, that they have to deal with the grief of like getting their hopes up for a better world and then not having it happen. But like sitting in a time where you're having your needs unmet and where things are harder and more difficult than they need to be, I don't think that's preferable to recognizing the situation you're in, hoping for better, trying to put the work in to do better, because regardless, you're still in the same situation. Being in denial doesn't make it more comfortable. But yeah, we're going to see some big shifts coming to the horse world soon, I think. The book recommendation was in the chat, and it said getting comfortable with uncertainty. Haven't read it, but that sounds interesting. It sounds like up my alley. I need to update my bookshelf on my website too, because I have a bunch of ones that are about like people and human experiences that have really changed my perspective on how I approach horses in the world at large, and just like how unhealthy and unnatural and harmful a lot of the things we've normalized in day-to-day life are, and like why we should be changing the way we do things. And it's just really helped me sit with the fact that there's been a lot of things that like intuitively I've been uncomfortable with in life, and then learning that there's merit to how I've been feeling has been really helpful. And it's helped change my perspectives on things a lot and just help me feel less alone. But yeah, so I think that's almost everything that I have to say. And like, thank you for everyone who's joined in. And I'm gonna try to do more of these. Like as I mentioned earlier, the biggest difficulty with this is just the amount of prep time involved. Like I almost need to do a part 2 for this, because there's definitely photos and videos that I missed putting in, just because it's like I've now had Milo for 11 years. And that's a lot of content to go through. Like eventually I'm going to edit a video comparing and contrasting the old footage of him, but I also need to shoot a lot more new footage, because now that I've started to do things differently, I've also stepped back from producing as much content as consistently as possible, because I think the pressure of doing that also led to bad training as well. So I need to find a way to streamline it, make it less stressful for me, and also open up more opportunities to have people filming with me in the first place, and get more new footage to compare and contrast. And that'll be coming hopefully in the new year. But yeah, there will hopefully be more of these for anyone who's interested in making it more possible, like supporting by subscribing to YouTube members or Patreon, or purchasing a ticket, or shopping at my store, or even just like watching, commenting, and sharing on the videos, which you can do for free. It helps boost me in the algorithm. It gets my stuff more seen. And if my channel gets to the point where it's feasible to put efforts into this channel and get like the ad revenue from AdSense needed to make it sustainable to just continue offering free content, that's honestly going to be my preference, to try to improve accessibility. But the amount of work that I have to put into filming, editing, and like producing the content, and then also the educational fees that I've had to do, it makes it not very realistic to just do that with the hopes that it's going to get consumed enough, especially when a lot of the stuff that's the foundational stuff is kind of boring to watch, and it's not as flashy with the fun, very good marketing before and afters. But yeah, like, so any of the support, just by sharing, supporting, liking, subscribing, turning on post notifications, if you start watching a video, trying to watch as much of it as you can initially, rather than just clicking it and going off of it, especially when it's first been uploaded, because that really skews the algorithm. But yeah, there's lots of stuff that you can do for free to support creators, and a huge part of it's just like supporting their content by commenting, and also trying to make the comments written in such a way that they don't immediately get clocked as like bot comments. So for example, just like posting an emoji isn't going to boost the post the same way as like saying a few words or like a sentence. So those are free ways to support, because like I do think the lack of accessibility in the horse world is difficult. And then also like marketing wise, people who post the really exciting before and afters and like explosive videos of horses tend to get more views because it's more immediately interesting to watch, and I get that. So that's where things have really shifted, where if you look at my channel, a lot of the videos that have gotten the most views are the exciting ones where Milo's bucking, freaking out, and I'm kind of making a mockery of his stress behaviors. And I'm doing more exciting things like jumping and doing stuff. And yeah, so it's definitely been a shift in like my algorithm in making these changes, because it's made it so that my content is no longer necessarily resonating with all the same people who used to like it, unless they've also seen similar shifts and changes. And it's also less engaging, especially to people who aren't like immediately in the horse world. Seeing the excited, explosive stuff is more interesting across the board. However, like future wise, like my goals and ambitions are largely going to be related to trying to link like my love of nature and going to beautiful places and like hiking and stuff with riding and getting out on more trail rides and doing like between the ears shots with the GoPro and like filming stuff like that. However, even that is, I'm needing to set my life up in a way where I can have the time to haul out and do things like that without it being a really stressful experience. Where I can take the time off to do like a whole day for that and like working and whatnot. So that's kind of the shift I'm looking for, because like long term, I think what will make me really happy is just doing like behavioral mod with horses and helping horses with behavioral problems and doing rehabs and showing like how hoof rehabs and like lifestyle rehabs and rewards based training really helps horses. My end goal is to be able to get my own property to do that on, because then I can construct it in a way that I think makes the most sense to help take horses from really high stress environments, including horses that might be stallions or horses who've been stabled extensively and have like really, really intense behavioral issues that make transitioning them to a healthier life more challenging because of the level of risk that they have on their own bodies or to other horses. But my goal is to get all that set up in a way so that I really am set up where I can document all of that, because it is very limiting when you're renting. You don't have full access to the property. It can be really expensive to bring horses in and out. There's a lack of space and a lack of setups to really do it in the way that would make it the most accessible and sustainable for me. So there's a lot of stuff that I kind of have shelved and on hold until I'm able to do it the way that I want, because it'll give me the most control over the situation, which means I can approach things in the way that I'm most comfortable with ethically. And then I can also ideally, hopefully, shape this towards linking it to like helping humans rehab from trauma and like linking the human component of it and doing like retreats. And just making it like a mindset shift where it's just showing like a different way of doing things and trying to help people and create like accessibility and do stuff in a way where it's not cost prohibitive, and there's like the opportunity to offer people scholarships or like access to training and stuff that they might not otherwise be able to afford, or access to horses when they otherwise might not be able to do that. That's the end goal, but it's a lofty one and it's very expensive. And it's something that it's like, I'm aware of the fact that once I can eventually make that happen and start doing the thing, I think that the revenue would generate from that, just because it would be more interesting content and I could put all of my time into doing that. But I have to get there first. And right now I don't have the same capacity to do that, especially when I'm working with client horses, because I'm limited with what I can film, how much I can film, if people are okay with me posting it publicly. And I'm also careful with like what clients I'll take on, because a lot of the horses who need the most help and are in the crappiest situations, I'm no longer willing to endanger myself and my body to go into those situations if the owners aren't willing to make changes like for turnout and whatnot, because it's just not like I'm basically being a band-aid fix in that situation. So anyways, that's the end goal. Hopefully one day it'll happen, because then I can look back at clips like this and like grab clips like this and be like, look, I said this all along. This was my dream, and now here it is. But yeah, so stuff like that, just like sharing, liking videos, shopping the store, subscribing, members. Also, I have a book coming out in April of 2026 that's going to go over a lot of this stuff, and it much more in depth, and is kind of just like about a lot of these exact topics. And that is another great way to support me. It's available for pre-order now if you check out my website, or you can buy it when it comes out. And there's going to be some cool opportunities coming up for people who don't have the funds right now. And I'll share those once I can get the go ahead from my publicist. That'll be like after the holidays. And yeah, so all of that stuff's going to be happening, and I look forward to being able to hopefully share it all. And now I'm just kind of waiting for there to be to hit like the winter solstice, for the days to get a little longer, for it to be less rainy and gross. And for just things to shift in a nicer winter direction. But thank you everyone for tuning in. If you enjoyed this, like once the recording of this is published, if you could comment on the recording and like the recording and share the recording, that's also meaningful, because all of the stuff on the live chat is not necessarily, it doesn't get posted in the comment section after. So if you don't mind doing that, that would be fantastic. And then I'm going to be doing more stuff as time goes on. Right now with the winter stuff, a lot of what I'm doing is like the boring, slow work. So a lot of that stuff does get posted to members only, because when I post it publicly, it doesn't get seen. So it's a lot of editing just for it to not get viewed, which I know sounds like very influencery, but it does matter for the work that I have to put in addition to working like my paid job. So that's what's going to be happening right now, is like a rest period, rehab period, lots of groundwork. And hopefully in the spring, we will pick up and have a bigger, more exciting year, because this past year, just like everything went wrong. Pogo tried to die, Banksy blew a huge abscess, and Milo had the hematoma thing, and then his metabolic flare up, and it just was not my year. So I'm hoping 2026 will be my year, knock on wood. And yeah, YouTube hates me because I say things about the government, and I say we shouldn't kill children in Palestine, and that's apparently very controversial. It's just be like, hey, maybe we should just not condone genocide. But now that I said genocide, watch this get shadow banned. Anyways, yeah, also criticizing the US government. I don't know if you guys saw the law change that they're trying to pass, where they're like, all visitors that want to come into the US, they're trying to make it so they can look at your social media for the last 5 years. And I was like, well, I'm never going to get to go to the US now. So I guess I'm staying here and just going to like Australia and the UK and anywhere but the US, which is really disappointing, because there's a lot of really cool places that I wanted to visit in the US, and Trump is ruining all of it. So fuck that guy. Fuck that guy big time. Anyone who still likes him, you shouldn't. Literally terrible person. Don't know how anyone can find a single redeemable quality in that man now, or how his behavior hasn't been a deal breaker. And also surprising that so many people, when I talk shit about him, are like surprised that I don't like the guy based on everything else I post. Because I feel like that should just be intuitive. He's a piece of shit. Literally one of the worst people on this planet. Fuck that guy. The US is beautiful though. Lots of amazing places. So here's to hoping he doesn't ruin them, because he's going to die before the full damage of everything he's done is actually visible, which is another reason why we shouldn't be having actual fossils running the world and being able to make such long-term decisions that they're not going to be around to see. Because like homeboy knows he's not going to live to see the demise of the world, even if he largely contributes to causing it. So younger people in power, and also people from more demographics, so that we actually cater to everyone in society, instead of creating this really one-sided perspective that basically is just these little political puppets that are dick riding billionaires. And we see it to a smaller extent in the horse world, where it's like the horse world competitively revolves around the people who are like the it people at the top, and they can do no wrong unless they finally do something bad enough that they get thrown under the bus. But usually it's just temporary, as seen with Helgstrand and Dujardin. So then after that, they're just like, oh, it's fine now. Everyone's going to forget about this. Let's just like do these things to try to humanize them and move on. And then once again, they're going to be at the tops of all of the magazine stuff. So yeah, 30 to 60-year-olds is reasonable to me. And also it's like, yeah, like the age that he's at, it's like, if you're highly likely to die within the next decade, I don't want you making decisions that are going to impact me for the next like 30 years, as someone who doesn't intend to die that soon and is statistically less likely to, because I'm young. Just really quick, do you reckon you'll have anything for international students like me and Aussie to come over for workshops somewhere down the track? Yes, I think realistically for clinics, any Commonwealth countries, so like anywhere in the UK or in Australia, way easier for me to get a work visa, way more feasible to go to. The main thing is just going to be making sure that the interest is there to cover all of the travel fees, because it's going to be more expensive to travel there. I will not be coming to the US anytime soon, because they make it very difficult to get a visa. And I straight up think even if I tried and I jumped through all the hoops, I don't think they'd give me one if they did any type of background check on me right now. Um, so for the US, if I go there, it would be for like events that aren't centered around me needing to get the work visa, where it's for like symposiums or something where I'm just a speaker at that event. Um, but I will, like, I'm trying to arrange because I've had some people in Australia express interest about running clinics, and it'll just be about arranging it to work so that my fees are covered before I get tickets and whatnot, because I really want to go. And I definitely have to come during Australian winter because I would die otherwise. But I definitely want to do that. And I've had interest. So it's just going to be about arranging it. One of the things that I've ran into with stuff like that is just that all of the visa requirements and then also talking to individuals and actually making the plans, it's a lot to take on with all the other stuff I've been doing. So I'm hoping at some point I can afford to like hire someone on to do that for me or somehow get the capacity to do that because it's also really outside of my organizational wheelhouse because I'm not organized at all. But I do want to do that, and it's been something I've been thinking about a lot because that's also what I want to move towards with my training is doing clinics because then people are coming there for those specific days to learn stuff that they'll take with them to use with their horses rather than this expectation where when you're doing regular clients locally and you're doing like full training for a month, for example, people are expecting you to hit certain milestones and deadlines on whatever timeline they've constructed in their head. And sometimes it results in them expecting a miracle to be worked or wanting to take the easy way or shortcut way out. Or they're just like really inconsistent and they don't do what needs to be done, but they still want their horse to be doing certain things. So that's frustrating. So clinics are kind of the wheelhouse where it's like I can do more, I can teach more people, I can give them toolboxes to take with them, and then the expectation is just like to continue facilitating their own learning. So yeah, that's definitely going to be plans that I'm going to look further into come 2026 and talk to people and kind of just look at getting that done and seeing when I can make it happen and when it'll work. But yeah, oh my God, average 35 to 40 degrees. I'd pass away. We'd probably have to do stuff in the mornings or at night. But no, I would make do. And I really want to go because I've never been to Australia. So, yeah, and then like Europe and stuff too. That's something that I want to do as well because it would be easier to get a visa for. The only bummer is that like even within the European Union, I think I have to apply to a visa for each individual country, which sucks. But so again, that's where it would come in to have someone to help me plan it that knows how to navigate the visa requirements and has already done that before and can contact people. So that's going to be something that I'll look into come 2026 because especially if my book does well, I'll have more financial capacity to do that. And yeah, same thing with like just continuing to build my business and do stuff like that. I'm just looking for the financial capacity to do stuff because I'm also really uncomfortable about the idea of hiring someone on and then not being able to guarantee work for them long term for myself financially, especially because like I don't know how much their help is going to add to the revenue. And I don't want to let people down. So that's why I've been doing a lot of this stuff myself. But I'm hitting the point where I've been hitting the point for a while where I need help. So yeah, anyways, thank you everyone for listening. If you want to watch the start of this, you can simply rewind on the recording. And I appreciate all of your support and hopefully we'll do more of these in the future. So thanks everyone and bye-bye. See you later.